Thank you. Okay, folks. Well, this has been a long time in the planning, but here we are, and we are formally commencing. My name is Anthony Beddy. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture, based here in Regent's Park College, that is a part of the University of Oxford. The centre began in 1994 and was founded by Emeritus plus two now principal, which was the Reverend Professor Paul Phillips, who is one of the respondents with us and will be speaking remotely. This day is part of a series of events that we have this term, called Trinity Term in Oxford. As a partnership between our centre and the Dialogue Society, we are pleased and honoured that from a number of representatives of the Dialogue Society with us today. I believe some of you have travelled as far as London to be with us, and we are really pleased to have you here with us. It is entirely appropriate that this event is with the Dialogue Society, given that the centre was initially called the Oxford Centre for Christianity and Culture, but our designation changed in 2019, I think in recognition of our much more plural set of dialogue partners, including many of you here in this room today. We are here to launch two books that have been authored by one of our associates of the centre, that's Professor Paul Weller, who's Emeritus Professor from Derby University, but also had links with Coventry University, and I believe is a graduate of this college. Yeah. And Paul, his books are, well, one of the books at the back. Okay, now initially when this was planned, it was hoped that we would have books for sale. Unfortunately, the books are not for sale. We all then hoped that we'd have both books for inspection, but only one of them is here for inspection. However, there are flyers there that has a code that if you wish to purchase the book for a discount, then please take one of the flyers. If we run out, then we can get some more printed up. And so you have every opportunity hopefully to buy the book at a discount price.
It's for 1 month that runs it. So.
Yeah, for 1 month. So you can't need to stop getting your skates on to do that.
And you can preview it in the open access free version. So you can decide whether you want to invest in it or not.
No, actually,
tell the
actually, so as the judge may sometimes say, please discount what has just been said. That has no bearing whatsoever in our future conversation. There is no open access. Go out and buy it with hard cash or buy electronic. What kind of salesman? No, ignore that. It is for sale and it's well worth the money. I know how long Paul has laboured in putting this together. If in doubt, if you ever think about trying to write 2 books at once, talk to Paul and he will dissuade you from doing such a crazy thing. But yes, he's written 2 books at once, and we're here to launch both books. And this will kickstart a series we have throughout this term on religion and dialogue. If you're not part of our regular mailing, then please let me know, and I'm more than happy to join. I'm not happy to add you to our list because we have a regular set of conversations. They're not normally a half-day symposium like this. We normally meet on a Monday at 5 o'clock in this room until about 6:15. So today we'll be meeting until 4 o'clock, and then we'll have a coffee break from 4 till 4:30, and then we'll continue. We will conclude at 6:15, and then we'll have a meal for those of you who have signed up. There may be some spare places depending upon who has signed up but not signed up. But anyway, we'll worry about that when we get to 6:15. Anyway, it's my pleasure now to hand over to Paul, who's the author of both these books, and he will kickstart our conversation with dialogue partners that include Dr. Martin Whittingham and Professor Paul Phillips. So.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Anthony, for the introduction and explanations, and for trying to save me from myself in relation to my poor salesperson presentation. So, yeah, please buy the books. It's really nice to be here, as Anthony says. Actually, the last time I had a book launch here was in 2005, when my book on reconfiguring religion, state and society was launched in this very room. So, and as Anthony says, before that, I was a student, undergraduate student here, 74 to 77. And I'm pleased to say my son has been able to come today, and I was just showing him and his partner, pointing out the room where I used to live when I was here as an undergraduate. So it's nice to be part of things in this way and to have this opportunity, particularly about these two books, which have been a kind of a labour of love and a lot of work, but a lot of support, both from the college itself, which I'd like to pay tribute to, that the college made it possible for me to do this work from this academic base in the University of Oxford, and of course also material support from the Dialogue Society and interest and ongoing encouragement, and thank you for that. As to those also who are either here in physical form today, like Professor Jørgen Nielsen, or remotely, like Professor Paul Fiddies and Dr. Martin Whittingham and Dr. Serena Hussain, who will be saying things in relation to the books that I've written. I'm very much looking forward to hear what they have to say, their questions, their critiques, and so on, and to opening up a wider conversation among us. So, enough of that, and what I'm going to try and do now is just give a brief overview of the contents of the book. So those of you who haven't had opportunity yet to look at it, I have some insight into how I've approached that. So Anthony first. And we can go on to the, yeah.
Is it a slideshow?
It is, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, then you could move on to the first. So basically, as you've already known, this is from where the project was being conducted. An important aspect of the project was that it was planned and supported critically through the university's Research Ethics Committee. Very important to say that, because the area of Hizmet and the person of Fethullah Gülen have certain controversies around them, and there are people who are very suspicious of certain kinds of writing in relation to these things, and therefore the fact that this project was conducted in a way that was, subject to properly academically rigorous questions about its research methods and how it was planned and conducted, and in the light of the university's conflict of interest policy, etc., is a foundational aspect of the project. So it was conducted primarily during 2017 to 2020, so over a period of 3 years. It's based, next click, primarily upon 29 semi-structured interviews with people including Fethullah Gülen himself, a number of his close associates, and particularly individuals publicly associated with Hizmet in the European context that has relevance particularly to one of the books. There are a number of also anonymous interviewees, that because they were asylum seekers or refugees, whose identity obviously one had to take special care of. This approach to doing the interviews, primarily people publicly associated with Hizmet, had certain disadvantages, which I acknowledge in the book. For example, in relation to gender profile, because those who have been in primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in leading positions in Hizmet organizations tend to be male more than female, but that is a kind of a consequence of the decision I took, that primarily would rest on people who could speak publicly in a context, particularly post-2016, when, as is explored in the European book, quite a number of people associated with Hizmet in Europe have been subject to either unspecific threats, but sometimes actual violence in different countries, and therefore that determined the shape, in a sense, of those who participated. And then overall, click please, just to say the general approach here is what I describe as a religious studies approach, not in that sense starting out theologically, nor indeed according to particular prior sociological theories, which can also act as a kind of glasses through which one looks at the phenomena. The attempt is to engage with the phenomena in as evidence-based way as possible, but not to exclude evaluative work, and also to recognize and take account of my own positionalities in relation to these things, not to pretend that one can be a detached observer. And indeed, partly in this book, I argue why it's important not, or at least in a way in both books, why it's important not to be just a detached observer. That actually one can be an engaged academic in an appropriate way. So, next slide. Something briefly about the relationship between the two books. They can be read completely independently. So you can buy one and not the other if you know okay, on the sales talk. But they were written together and they're intended to be complementary to each other in the sense that certain things, well, there isn't space and time to go into in one book, but a cross-reference is made to where it is possible to go into it in the other book. So, for example, the European book is really focused on Hizmet in Europe, not on Hizmet in Turkey, which many people kind of assume it might be about because of the history. Of course, it says something about that, but it's primarily focused on European countries other than Turkey. Turkey, European or not, question mark, big question. But the Gülen book, almost necessarily because it looks at his own development contextually, takes more account of the Turkish context of that trajectory than does the European book. So they interplay with each other. Anthony Moore clicks down, and you can click down rapidly these little bullet points in the way that these two books interrelate. So in a way, the whole argument about both books coming at the thing from different ends is that one cannot understand properly the Hizmet movement in Europe without understanding Fethullah Gülen and his teaching and practice, but one can't understand that without first of all taking serious account of how that has contextually developed and changed in his kind of own life, but then also in interaction with Hizmet as it in different contexts has developed and spread itself in this setting, in Europe in particular, but of course it's also a global phenomenon and not just a European one. And it's this interplay and interaction and looking at things from two ends of the telescope, you could say, that in a way the two books kind of represent, because the book about Gülen is also not a biography of Gülen. It could have been that, but it's not that in the sense it discusses him in the context of his interaction with the movement. So it's not, and the book about Hizmet in Europe is not just looking at that as a kind of external set of phenomena, historical, migratory, and all of that, but looks and tries to understand it as it understands itself as a religiously based, informed phenomena inspired through the teaching and practice of Fethullah Gülen. So, next slide. So basically the two books then, the shape and contents and structure, very sort of normal way of starting off with acknowledgements and introduction. So it speaks a bit about the focus of the book and explains what I in brief said about a religious studies approach. Importantly, in both books, I try to situate what I'm looking at in the wider literature. That includes highly critical literature of either the phenomenon of the Hizmet movement, if one wants to call it that, or the person and teaching of Fethullah Gülen, because as I've acknowledged at the beginning, from a number of perspectives, these can be seen as quite controversial. And so it's important to try to show, at least as far as I'm concerned, that I've tried to engage with and have an awareness of a very wide range of literature about this person and about this movement. Different kinds of literature, some of it political science, some of it theological, some of it sociological, some of it popular, but all of it has a bearing, I think, on what I'm looking at, and therefore I try to do some serious discussion of that in the introduction to the book, and then explain a little more concretely and perhaps boringly, unpack the ways in which I actually went about doing the work. So the research methods actually employed, when and where, and so on and so forth. So next slide. So the book on Fethullah Gülen falls into a number of distinct parts, and the first part is headed as Turkish Muslim scholar, preacher, and activist. To say there do exist biographies. This isn't an attempt to be a biography. The most developed biography that does exist is by John Parle, who very kindly gave a comment on the cover of this book. That perhaps is the most extensive, historically studied, rooted work on his biography. But I tried then to look at the way in which person, place, and development interplay in Fethullah Gülen's life. In a way, this is nothing new in this. This is a kind of a schemata that's been used by quite a number of people. I've given it my own labels according to the place that was the focus of his life and ministry at certain times, starting off in a very traditionalist part of Turkey, and a traditional contextualization there, but one which was marked by special things at certain times. So, for example, this was the place and time for his first encounter with the life, with the work of Said Nursi and with his followers, and one can see in the practice and teaching of Gülen that influence coming through in ways that I'll touch on briefly in a few minutes. He then moved to a very much more secular environment, challenged by the region of Turkey where secular currents were strong, and challenged by strong currents of modernity in a way that was not the case contextually in the area in which he was born, and needed to start to think through and react and develop his thinking and teaching in the light of that. Then in Izmir, very much more cosmopolitan environment. So hence I called it creative contextualization through differentiation. And then in Istanbul, which was a kind of a combination partly of a period of withdrawal, because that was a period of time when he was under suspicion and under active manhunt from military forces, but then also it later became a place where much more cosmopolitan engagement, in particular in public acts of engagement with people from religious leaders from different backgrounds, particularly Jewish and Christian, took place in that period. So it then goes into really what I guess Hizmet as a movement is perhaps best known for as a brand in the world. That's to say its association with educational initiatives of one kind or another, and shows how this was very much at the starting point of Fethullah Gülen's work in relation to other people who were inspired by him, and then took initiatives forward, not only in education, but starting very much around educational development. And from that educational starting point, then geographically spreading out from Turkey then to Europe, Turkish Eurasia, and beyond. But then coming back to this characterization that at certain points in time, Gülen has been seen as enemy of the state in one form or another. So next slide. So the second part, having set the scene, person, places, and development, called Islamic rootedness, taboo breaking, and socio-religious implications. Turmoil as Turkish context. Turkey has been a society and a state in substantial turmoil. The British historian Arnold Toynbee characterized Turkey as a society and a state that was trying to ride two horses at once, the inheritance of traditionalisms and the challenges of modernity, and always had the danger of falling in between the two horses or running off with one or the other and so on. And that turmoil, and also its outworkings in different ways, and the very strong and deep political divisions that at certain periods of time impacted, have formed part of the whole context out of which Gülen was formed as a scholar. Now, I call him here distinctive scholar, teacher, and innovator. In many ways, he is a very traditional person, presents tradition. When you meet him, as I've had the opportunity to do, you realize you're in the presence of a traditional Islamic teacher. And one can't really understand him. It's not right to portray him as some kind of small L liberal Islamic intellectual. That isn't correct. He comes out of a strong and deep tradition, of a traditional but properly traditional kind. That means to say one that isn't banned by tradition but works with tradition in interaction with context and new challenge, and doesn't run away from the challenge, but takes the tradition and the challenge and works with them together. Hence, to that extent, I call him innovator. But I know this is a controversial term, or it can be a controversial term in the context of Islam and what that might mean. But I mean innovator in the sense of not simply repeating old formulae, but applying deep learning from Quran, from Sunnah, from Hadith, to in interaction with contemporary realities, rather than letting them run parallel or setting them up oppositionally. And the way in which that works itself out, again, in this section, and I haven't got time to go into it here, we might discuss some of them, or presenters might pick up on some. In many ways, he has overcome a number of what I call taboos, because those are quite deep senses of things you don't do or are dangerous to do in the context either being a Muslim or being of Turkish background, and he's acted in ways that have challenged those taboos, both secular, political, national, cultural, and of religious boundaries. Then, next slide. I've called Islamic spirituality and social processing, because here what I was trying to do was pick up on the fact that one could argue that one of the biggest things facing the Muslim world, in inverted commas, is its sense of insecurity at multiple levels. And some of that has to do with also looking backwards towards what is perceived to have been a golden age, a heroic, which is also a heroic age in many ways. And what I think Fethullah Gülen presents, from my understanding and engagement, is a form of Islam where one does not have to be apologetic, is not based in insecure reactions to a different world, a different environment, a different set of religions, and therefore operates according to what I call an alternative hermeneutics. And that hermeneutics is not rooted in heroic stories of early Muslims. It's rooted in using an interpretive, a hermeneutic key to do with a very strong and deep theme found in particularly Sufi Islam of the true human, love and service, the word Hizmet meaning, of course, service, and that these are the hermeneutic keys which he then uses in order to work his understanding of Islam in the contemporary world. That has certain consequences. For example, there is a very strong position in relation to human freedom, including freedom of religion or belief, in a way that isn't always found among Muslim leaders in the world, that does protest against the notion of theocracy in the name of God, recognizes democracy isn't ideal or perfect and has many forms, but that theocracy is not the way forward, and challenges, of course, the alignment of Islam with terror and approaches a different stance by, I've used here a phrase, de-radicalization by default, which is actually the title of one of the books from the UK Dialogue Society. So, speeding on, because I don't want to take too much time, I'm still only on the first book. The next section, okay, Islamic heroism, Hizmet lost, and a future beyond Gülen, because what has happened, of course, post-2016 is that this incredibly developed movement in its original heartlands in Turkey has been broken apart by what happened post the events 2016. And that leaves an existential trauma. That trauma is explored a bit for different groups of people in Hizmet in Europe in different ways in that book. But here, it's also explored in relation to Fethullah Gülen himself. Again, when one meets him and interviews him, one has the sense of how deeply traumatic, because he also feels himself, I think, responsible in some way. The people who followed him or followed his teaching are now sometimes in a very, very difficult, or have been in a very, very difficult position in their home society or in other societies. So how Hizmet and how Fethullah Gülen starts or can't start or can start, or how far they can go with understanding this trauma, with working with this trauma, called him here a wounded exile, and this raises all kinds of questions around how far things can be fitted into traditional frameworks. For example, some people try to say, okay, and Fethullah Gülen himself in some of his teaching draws some parallels, not exact, very carefully delineated, but some parallels with Hijra, the Prophet, and can these parallels be drawn? Is this a way of understanding what's happened to Hizmet or not? And how far should one self-critique in the light of what did or did not happen in terms of how Hizmet developed, particularly in its Turkish context? How far does that self-questioning go? Does it have limits, etc.? And then finally, in the final chapter of the book I called Inheritance, Methodology, Integrity and Creativity, because what I'm trying to argue in this book is that Fethullah Gülen, and what I particularly tried to bring out in this concluding chapter, is that he doesn't leave behind what you might call a deposit of teaching, around which then disciples or followers are expected then to construct a future. One might argue that's what happened, particularly in the case of Said Nursi and those who followed him, and sometimes that led to serious debate and conflict between different groups who had the true inheritance, who owned the true inheritance. What I think Gülen is leaving in that sense, and there's always a question, he's alive now, he's not physically very well, what happens when he is no longer in this world? But I think what I try to argue in this final chapter is that he leaves behind, and it sounds a rather cold word, a cold way of describing it, a methodology more than an inherited deposit of teaching. A methodology that's focused also on this learning by doing, that's in the action of doing the things that are explored earlier in the book, the taboo breaking, the development of educational initiatives and all of that, through the learning of it, it's that action-based learning, always in touch with and in dialogue with Quran, Sunnah, Hadith, etc., and with people as they're living in the world. But it's that methodology that is bequeathed, and therefore, one can speak legitimately. It's a debate within the movement about that, how far you can speak like that, but going beyond Gülen, and perhaps finding ways in conjunction with others, not only with Muslims, but with people of other faiths and with secular people, with shared visions of what I've called here now ecumenical ijtihads in action in future, trying to discover those ways forward. So in very brief overview, that's roughly what I think that book is about, and I've now reached the end of the time that I really should have taken. So probably what I might do actually is stop there, because we'll see if the two respondents who are going to pick up on that first book, it will be hopefully, certainly I'm interested to hear what they've got to say about that. And I might then do something very brief about the structure and content of the other book in between the sessions. That might make more sense. And it won't take me as long, because what I was trying to explain at the beginning of this session about the complementarity of the two books and the methodology approach, that's all common to both, so it doesn't have to be repeated. So maybe that's the best way to, subject to Anthony's guidance.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So let's then hand over. And then after we've had input from Professor Fiddies and Dr. Whittingham, there'll be opportunity also for discussion in the round. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we hand over to you now, Professor Paul Fiddies.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, if only remotely, and to add my congratulations to Paul for his two books that we're launching today. Thank you, Paul, for inviting me to respond and generously giving me about 30 minutes for my review of your book, Fethullah Gülen's Teaching and Practice. Now, I apologize if I inevitably repeat some of the points you've just made, but the first thing to say is that this fine, exceptional book isn't a conventional study of its subject, Fethullah Gülen. There are a number of such studies available, and Paul has both drawn attention to them and acknowledged some debt to them. But his book is of a different and, I think, more adventurous kind. It does contain expected biography, and his second chapter tells Gülen's story well, tracing his journey, one might say migration, to use a word of Islamic resonance, from his birthplace of Erzurum through Edirne, Izmir and Istanbul to America. The book also contains some exegesis of Gülen's writings, giving particular attention, I find, to his 4 books on Sufism and his 2004 volume, Towards a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance. But the essence of the book seems to me to lie in the words of its subtitle, Context and Interactive Development. The method of the book is largely to understand Gülen's teaching and practice through a critical account of the response to Gülen from participants in the Hizmet movement from around the world, gathered by careful qualitative research, including extended interviews. It's an ethnographic approach of studying Gülen from within his own community. Most of these interviewees are named with their permission, while others have preferred to remain anonymous. There's a solid and convincing hermeneutical reason for proceeding in this way. Paul's argument is that Gülen's own method has been, from his earliest days of preaching, dialogical and contextual. He has been what Paul calls an embodied teacher, and Gülen has himself developed his teaching and practice in interaction with his students and other members of the Hizmet community. The influence he's had on others has, Paul maintains, been reflected back through a hermeneutical circle into the further development of his own thought. Effectively then, Gülen and Hizmet cannot be separated in their mutual story. Paul here appeals at a late stage of his research to the 2021 thesis of Özcan Keleş that there is an interplay within and between Hizmet's doings and Gülen's sayings over an expansive temporospatial access against a range of issues. Those are the words of Keleş. But Paul appears to have come to the same conclusion independently for himself much earlier on. While N.S. Jørgen suggests that Gülen's breakthrough out of a closed circle of sterile repetition of texts and principles came through his compassionate concern for education, Paul suggests it also came from the contribution made to Gülen's life, practice, thinking and teaching by the community of Hizmet. The word context in Paul's subtitle thus seems to me to bear several meanings. On the one hand, he's placing Gülen's thought and practice in the context of the community that he inspired, following the track of interactive development. This leads to a fascinating exploration of what the future of Hizmet might be after Gülen's passing. On the other hand, Paul finds context important in terms of the situating of Gülen's thought within the synthesis created by the coming together of Turkish culture with Islam. And here he follows Jørgen in finding that Gülen's model is one that regenerates, I quote, a tolerant interpretation and understanding of Muslim Turkish Sufism within contemporary circumstances, although offering a more socially orientated and global vision. But third, context refers to Gülen's exegetical method of contextualization, reading the Quran, the Sunnah, and Hadith in a way that allows for changing contexts in space and time. Paul shows how, while rooted deeply in the traditional Islamic disciplines, Gülen always looks to the requirements of time and location as a principle of interpretation, based in the conviction that the divine revelation is vital, present, and continuous. Gülen's outlook here seems to me extraordinarily close to the view of the relation between scripture and tradition developed in the Catholic Church at Vatican II, though Paul himself doesn't make this suggestion. In turn, this particular observation about context offers an insight for the future of Hizmet that Paul shares with a number of its members. There's the hope that the movement will not treat Gülen's writings as a fixed deposit to be merely preserved, as happened with Said Nursi's writings in the Nursu movement, but will undertake a process of localization, following Gülen's own example of developing his thought in new ways, in new contexts, and so adapting it flexibly in new cultural forms. Paul shows how Gülen himself adapted the traditional 5 purposes of Islam by adding the 6th principle of freedom, including freedom of religion, which he judged to be necessary in the modern world. And Paul then records one member of Hizmet as suggesting that a 7th should be added in the present climate crisis, that of care for the environment. Paul's own suggestion for the future direction of Hizmet picks up Ihsan Yilmaz's concept of ijtihad by conduct, in which Islamic principles and laws can be understood in the very process of acting in a way that fits the changing needs of society. In agreement with a Hizmet participant, Abdul Karim Balki, he suggests that this approach is faithful to Gülen's activism. And Paul himself proposes it will be best expressed ecumenically by involving those of other religions in the making of such ijtihads or decisions of principle. Yet there's another level of Paul's dialogical method which gives the book an even greater originality. As strictly an outsider in Islamic religion, he nevertheless places himself empathetically, though not uncritically, within the Hizmet community and becomes himself a respondent to Gülen, like his interviewees. Relating personal conversations he's had with Gülen, he creates his own perspective on his subject. And it seems to me there's just a hint in Gülen's recorded response to him, as, for example, in his positive reception of Paul's reading of the Beatitudes, that Paul may even have become part of the hermeneutical circle of Gülen's developing thought. But regardless of this exciting possibility, Paul effectively offers his own processing of Gülen's teaching in the spirit of the interactive development he highlights. And this seems to me to constitute a valuable dimension of the book. I mean Paul's focus on the idea of love as central to Gülen's teaching and activity. He cites Jørgen's observation that Gülen presents many personalities and moves quickly from one discipline to another in his writing, so that, I quote, we need to start first perhaps by systematizing his way of thinking, and his discourse has to be processed. That's quotations from Jørgen. Without over-systematizing, with the idea of love, Paul has in fact offered, it seems to me, some processing, or we might say, theologizing. And here I need to be transparent about my own approach to reviewing Paul's book, which is not from the standpoint of expertise in Islamic scholarship, but from the stance of a Christian theologian who's engaged in research into the meaning and practice of love in religion. I therefore dissent somewhat from the distinction Paul makes between religious studies and theology, remarking as he does that theology, I quote, usually entails the making an application of normative, evaluative judgments, which he is avoiding in his account. Good theology, I suggest, is ready to adapt and modify norms in the face of qualitative inquiry into human community, based in the conviction that revelation is ongoing and personal rather than static and propositional, something we've heard that Paul sees in Gülen himself. In presenting Gülen as advancing not relativism, but distinct normativity or an adaptation of norms to a distinct context, I suggest that Paul is including Gülen within a theological framework. Indeed, Paul claims that Gülen is doing constructive theology, just as I suggest Paul is doing. He admits this himself when he comments that neither Gülen nor Hizmet can be properly understood without leaving, I quote, open explanatory space for the possibility of the unexpected being at work in ways that cannot be completely accounted for in humanly and historically reductionist terms. In this book, there is then a pervasive tendency to systematize Gülen's thought and action around the idea and practice of love, human and divine. That's how it seems to me. Paul rightly refers twice to Gülen's own statement that, I think if you're going to name one thing that lies at the heart of Islam, I would say that it is love. And he cites Gülen's quotation of the poet Rumi's invitation, come, come and join us, as we are the people of love devoted to God. Come, come through the door of love and join us and sit with us. Paul also properly appeals to the influence of the central place of love in Sufism, which was both the ethos of Gülen's early years and the basis of Said Nursi's writings, which influenced him in his youth. Paul records Muhammad Çetin, a close associate of Gülen from his days in Erzurum, as recalling, he talked about Rumi and his love of God, and how he deals with the people and embraces all people, that sort of all-embracing love. The issues, he didn't go into the political issues. In his article on love, Madavar, in the first volume of his work on Sufism, Gülen notes that Sufis have defined love as the relation of the heart with the truly beloved one, the irresistible desire felt for him, the struggle to comply with his desires or commandments in all acts and thoughts, and the state of being enraptured and intoxicated without sobriety until the time of union or reunion. However, for all this, we should note that Gülen does not seem to use the idea of love as an organizing principle in his thought. His book, Towards a Global Civilization of Love and Tolerance, begins with a profound section on love and mercy, but his succeeding sections on tolerance, ideal humanity, terrorism, education, and globalism do not obviously rely on his earlier exposition of the nature of love. Reference in the definition I've just quoted to complying with God's commandments is characteristic of an Islamic understanding that, as Gülen notes later in his article, love can be defined as obedience, devotion, and unconditional submission in the context of a servant's love of God. Often then, when Gülen refers to human love of God, this is equivalent to devotion to God in general, rather than a specific dimension of religious experience. As he puts it in Towards a Global Civilization, love of God is our faith, it is our belief. Paul notes that Sunni and Landman, 2015, find Gülen as integrating clusters of concepts in his worldview. First, tolerance, love, and compassion. Second, dialogue, peace building, and coexistence. And third, responsibility, civility, and citizenship. Love in this analysis, we notice, is just part of one cluster. But in this book, Paul has in effect plucked it out and found it to be an integrating thread, highlighting it in a number of areas of Gülen's thought. This is a kind of processing of Gülen's ideas, it seems to me, but thoroughly illuminating and, in my view, totally valid within his dialogical method. Thus, for example, in Paul's account, love is closely associated with Gülen's commitment to diversity and what Paul calls principled plurality. Gülen's spirituality, life of prayer, and consciousness of God is sooner seen as rooted in an ontological domain of love and the permeative presence of divine love in the cosmos. Love is contrasted with conflict and is understood to be basic to all human relationships. Love for Gülen, asserts Paul, is connected theologically with freedom, and especially freedom of religion, so that tolerance isn't just a liberal adaptation to the modern world, but is rooted deeply in the nature of God as love. It's surely part of Paul's method of interactive study of Gülen's thought and practice that he himself feeds back to Gülen what he perceives to be the focus of his thought, asking him in personal conversation what his advice would be to a person of a non-Muslim religion who wanted to be a better lover of God. Gülen's answer includes the affirmation that the way we talk about the roads, the paths that take a servant to the path of the love of God, to become a lover of God and the beloved of God, I believe those paths are essentially very similar. His advice is that the lover of God in another religion should hold more deeply to the pillars and messengers of their own faith in order to lift human life to a more angelic life. The reader, at least this one, senses that Paul has prompted Gülen here to a systematic statement of his thought. Paul's theologizing of Gülen's thought is most clearly expressed in his proposition that Gülen's thought is best understood as a combination of love with a concern with the human. Love and the human, he concludes, are the two keys to both Gülen and the nature of Hizmet as offered by his interviewees. And he proposes that they can be integrated in what Sufism calls the perfect human. And there's a section called the ideal human in Gülen's Love and Tolerance. This is not an impossibilist perfection, explains Paul, but a dynamic state of being characterized, in the words of one Hizmet interpreter, as enhancing the skills of the physical and the spiritual as God wills. Paul makes a start on what this might mean concretely by suggesting that members of Hizmet use their experience of being oppressed to share in the wider human experience of suffering and injustice, and so to work together with those of other religions in creating ecumenical ijtihads which can focus on love and the human. He ends the book with a call to continuously renewed and contextualized engagement with religious and spiritual sources centered on love and the human. A reviewer always wants more from an author than he or she has offered in the limited compass of one book, but it's here that more detailed working out of the implications would be welcome. The claim for the combination of love and the human is a large one, not just in exegesis of Gülen, but in a program for future activism in which the author sees the inheritance of Gülen to be embodied. This book is certainly not an uncritical exercise in admiration of both Gülen and Hizmet, though it's an appreciative and sympathetic account. One significant move which Paul has adopted from Özan Keleş, who is the chair of the Dialogue Society's Board of Trustees, is a critique of what Keleş calls a post-fact justification of Hizmet's experience of loss and, to a large degree, defeat of its aims on its home ground of Turkey. While the movement's ability to cope with this is rooted in Gülen's long-standing challenge to a heroic image of Islam as always victorious in conflict, Keleş also detects a whitewashing of loss through simply assigning religious causality to events. One Hizmet member, recorded by Paul, for example, suggests that the exile was God's judgment on their failure to spread the Hizmet message beyond the borders of Turkey, and was God's way of ensuring this would happen. A related diagnosis was actually made by Gülen himself, writing, "It appears that God and destiny pushed members of Hizmet forcibly to live in other parts of the world so that they can display this beautiful face of Islam and tell the world that Islam cannot be represented by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So," Gülen concludes, "I see this representation of Islam in a positive and peaceful way through members of Hizmet as some good that came out of this terrible situation." While Keleş does not deny the validity of this interpretation, he is concerned that always taking a positive view of loss simply reinforces the connection between the blessing of Allah and material blessings and inhibits a search for mistakes that may have been made. This critique of post-fact justification could in fact be related to the centrality of love by a Christian theologian, though probably not by a Muslim with strict views of the irresistible will and impassibility of God. I mean that losses and disasters like the persecution and exile of Hizmet can be understood not as part of a predestined course of life, but as also suffered by a God whose love is vulnerable and whose aims can, at least in the immediate future, be frustrated by human evil. Paul, from his stance as a sympathetic participant observer, does not make any such theological move, and it would probably be improper within the constraints of his method. We may add, however, there are perhaps the seeds of this idea in Gülen's insistence that Islam intends to, he says, guide a person to worldly and eternal happiness through his own will, The emphasis on his own will is important, which means that any kind of pressure, any kind of force has no place in the heart of Islam, end quote. Though Gülen, I think, has only human force in mind here, not divine pressure in the course of history. Also conditioning Gülen's understanding of love is a dualistic view of the cosmos, which Paul notes but doesn't comment upon. Reflecting on the different paths to God in different faiths, Gülen affirms that the essence of this path is to leave behind the corporeality of human life and to go into the life of the heart and the spirit, and to reach this integration of the heart and mind, and to live in the angelic qualities as much as is possible in the human domain. Citing Al-Ghazali, Gülen observes that animal tendencies in human life cause us to stray from the center of love. All these quotations, by the way, from Fethullah Gülen are from Paul's book. In his book on love and tolerance, Gülen asserts that the sphere of the manifestation of love is the soul. Such a view, it seems to me, is bound to take the Platonist kind of view that love experienced in the human body is only the first stage towards a spiritual love of the divine. So that Gülen, in his article on Madhava, writes of a lover who transcends his or her self with the wings of love and reaches the Lord at the points of passion and enthusiasm. Any systematic understanding of love and God and neighbor would need to reflect further on whether this self-transcendent love is quite as distant from corporeal love, what Gülen calls figurative or metaphorical love, as Gülen envisages, since love of the body surely can never be separated from love of the spirit in service, Hizmet, to the neighbor. If Paul were to develop further his proposition that the combination of love and the human results in the perfect human being, he would perhaps need to question whether it's possible to develop this within a dualistic view that human beings need to leave behind their animal nature and attain to the angelic in order to be the true mirror or image of God. But these questions from a Christian theologian, and I warned you this was the review of a Christian theologian, only show how successful Paul has been in his method of creating a dialogue between Gülen and members of his movement, an interaction in which he has sympathetically, though critically, placed himself. He has succeeded in also drawing the reader, such as myself, into the same process. And it's clear from his portrait of Fethullah Gülen that this truly exceptional Hokai Effendi himself would approve. That's the end of my review. And I think that Martin, who follows me, may well adopt a more dialogical and questioning method than I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. I will, if I can find Martin. There he is, there he is.
Is something being said to me there? I can't quite tell.
Yes, hello, Martin. Yes, you are on screen and you can wait your words.
Right, great. Thank you. Sorry, I think we were waiting for each other there slightly. Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry not to be with you in person. Could I just ask a side question? Is it possible to have a rough idea of how many people are in the room with you? I just find my mind curious on that.
Yes, 25.
Yeah, that's okay. That's pretty much the kind of number I was imagining. Thank you. It's just nice to know to whom I'm speaking. Well, thank you for this invitation, and I realise I'm following on from two Pauls. So although I know them both, I will try and keep them separate if I need to. But thank you for Professor Fides for your very fluent thoughts there, and obviously to Paul Weller for the invitation today. This is to Paul Weller. I think what I'll do, I know we discussed the format of this a little, I will walk through my own thoughts. I think for the sake of coherence, not stopping with questions along the way, but then hopefully I've prepared a simple PowerPoint, which I'll share in a moment, which will just pause on each of the kind of leading questions, if you like, that I wanted to raise and explore, which I hope would help you identify them. So we'll see how long my thoughts take, and then perhaps lead into some conversation, guided as you wish, Paul. So I will attempt to share screen. Right, I think that's better. So I come to this, and I said this to Paul Weller, not as a scholar of Gülen, but I am someone very interested in interreligious relations. Within that, my work, as you can see there, is in the area of Christian-Muslim relations, but I also spend quite a while in the area of classical Islam. So that will probably be reflected in some of my comments, those various interests as we go along. I appreciated about Paul's book, the biography, because as someone who's been aware of Gülen's name for a long time, but never really sat down to read a lengthy study, it was very interesting to read of his geographical and other progressions to give me a framework for the ideas we were reading. And likewise, very interesting to see it made explicit the emphasis on education, which again, I've been aware of in terms of institutions founded around the world. Thirdly, it was interesting to hear the voices of adherents of the movement in their various quotations and discussions. Just a very minor point, and perhaps a question, sorry, Paul, this isn't on the PowerPoint, but I wondered about your thoughts about speaking to people outside of the movement, or perhaps former members of the movement. Now, I know one can't encompass everything in one book. I'm sure that would be an interest of yours too. Because you end up with twice the work if you're exploring also perhaps people who've even moved away from it. But clearly some very interesting and appreciative voices there. And perhaps if I move towards the end of the book to at the start of what I'm saying, paradoxically, I was interested in the section on self-criticism. And particularly a sort of broad theme for this, the changes that Gülen has undergone through his interaction with Hizmet is something that comes up. I'll come back to that later. I wondered if one of those was a change away from what you call the heroic in Islamic thought, which I'll explore a little bit more anon. So that's one question I'd be interested in raising, just setting out some more of those changes that have occurred specifically through his interaction with the movement. I was also intrigued to see the discussion that has gone on within the movement about the founding or not of other organizations, related organizational structures, and some people feeling that there were too many other structures and organizations being spun off or added to the movement, depending on how one sees it, and others seeing that as a very helpful way of extending activity. These discussions sound very familiar within any organization. It seems to me that has a new and perhaps flexible structure. Another point that caught my interest in these initial thoughts was, you mentioned Fethullah Gülen's comment on researchers needed to distinguish between the changing and the unchanging in the Islamic tradition and thought, obviously something that transfers over to other faiths as well. Yes, and the hermeneutical steps that are involved in trying to distinguish the changing from the unchanging, again, perhaps something I'll come back to later. And another point that caught my eye, which Professor Fides has already mentioned, yes, the the possible extension of the 5 essentials of Islam. This is a formulation that was, I think, made explicit by Al-Ghazali and then Ash-Shatibi. The preservation of life, religion, a clear mind, and so forth. I won't list them all. And the possibility of adding to these freedom. Okay, perhaps if I move to another question. I was struck by this quotation from one of the quotes from Gülen in the book, "There is nothing wrong with Christianity," and his exhortation to a couple who were considering leaving Christianity and embracing Islam not to do so. I thought that was very interesting, and I'd love to hear more, Paul, perhaps about the implications of discouraging conversion to Islam. I was interested because my limited, very limited reading of Gülen on the Bible, which is a particular interest of mine, Muslim views of the Bible, shows that he seems quite traditional. And as I said, I'm no expert, but he seems quite traditional in his view of the Bible. I mean, traditional in Muslim terms, in seeing it as partly corrupted. And also he draws on some very familiar biblical verses to establish the presence of Muhammad in the Bible. But the question I thought was interesting: what are the implications of discouraging conversion to Islam? And his comment, "There is nothing wrong with Christianity," which is, I take it, and it seems very much to be the case, as practiced today. Not just there is nothing wrong with an original and pure teaching of Jesus, which has then perhaps gone astray in its historical outworking. That would be quite a common Muslim view through history. Moving on, the relationship to the traditions of classical Sunni scholarship, which you mentioned him being clearly located in that. And perhaps that in relation to your comment about, well, not comment, your discussion of what you call theological insecurity in the modern day, leading some Muslims perhaps to reach for power, whether forcefully or not, in various ways. This is a complex area. It seems to me that such endorsement as there was in the early centuries of Islam, of certainly seeking the predominance of Islam in various ways, including the early conquests, was not related to theological insecurity. It's taken as a given, a normal state of affairs, if you like, that Islam should become preeminent in various ways. So I wondered if Gülen sees that what he calls, or what you call, the heroic tradition, in inverted commas, a focus on battles and the strength of the Muslim community in various ways, is a misreading of early Islam by figures in early Islam and beyond. One of your interviewees mentions how the focus on certain battles or in early history works, I think he says, is mistaken. I forget the exact comment, my apologies. But certainly this is one quite prominent and, if you like, normative stream within the early centuries and beyond of Islam. So I wondered how Gülen sees this in relation to his rootedness in Quran and Sunnah, but also in the traditional classical Sunni scholarship, which you mentioned at one point. And I know you highlight his rereading of the life of Muhammad to focus on other relationships, relationships with friends and so forth, rather than focusing on battles. And that's certainly a very live debate, I think, today. But I just wondered how you understood Gülen to understand the prior centuries of tradition in that regard. Let me move on to another area. Paul, at various points, you mentioned authentic Islam, or an authentically Islamic approach. And this would be an interesting area to explore. At one point, you mentioned that there is a need, and Gülen embodying this perhaps, to defeat terror on genuinely Islamic grounds, not really those of liberal Islam. I thought that was an interesting comment. because I would imagine that many liberal Muslims, so-called, whether one wants to use the word progressive Muslims, which is often used, whether they would see themselves also, I would imagine they would, as standing very much on authentic Islamic grounds, but interpreting those grounds differently. So I'd be very glad to hear some reflection on your thoughts on the word authentic. There has been quite some discussion in recent years. Shahab Ahmed's book, What is Islam? And another book originally in German, which has just come out in English, called The Culture of Ambiguity by Thomas Bauer, both of which are exploring in what ways the Islamic tradition, broadly defined, should be. What does it mean for something to be Islamic? Anyway, that's not my intention to go into those here, but the whole question of what is authentic Islam is a really live and interesting one, I think. So perhaps as I draw towards a conclusion of my thoughts, I might also mention this. This isn't your phrase, but I think it captures it. The attainment of cut through. You call it breaking through in your book, which I relate to the remarkable spread and strength of the Gülen movement, and what you feel has enabled that, given the blend we've seen here of new emphases perhaps, and yet a certain relationship with tradition as well, which others are also exploring in various ways, that complex blend. What has given Gulen and Hizmet the capacity to break through, as you call it? I'm borrowing the phrase cut through, I think, from discussions of elections that often go on. When will particular parties cut through? As I mentioned at the beginning, I'd be interested to hear more about what are the key things that Gülen himself has changed through his engagement with the movement, perhaps some of this balance of the new and the traditional, the movement between classical and contemporary thinking. One other final question, which is really just one of mine, and you might feel it goes a bit beyond the brief of your book, which is fine, but it kind of emerges out of the material. How does Hizmet relate to different other Muslim groups? Because as I touched on, it seems to me some of these strands of thought are quite present in other Muslim. They might not be formal movements, but whether one wants to call it progressive Islam or rereading of the life of Muhammad and so forth. So that might take us off at a tangent. But I just wondered how Hizmet relates to other strands of new thinking and people wrestling with within Islam, as wrestling with how they relate to what you could call the classical tradition, very broadly defined. So I guess on that, for now, I will pause. I suppose one of my headline points is the relationship of tradition and innovation. As you mentioned, Paul, in your presentation, innovation can have complex implication in Islam. It's often in the past been used to denote heresy, but I use it in a neutral sense, as I think you did too. So perhaps having hung out those questions, I will pause there and perhaps invite you, Paul, to pick up some or all of them.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to both Martin and Paul. You've both done what I hoped you would do, coming out of the work that I know you're engaged with in a broader sense, and therefore you brought to the books and what I've tried to do, or particularly in this volume of the two books, your wider perspective out of which you're working, and that's good. I know Paul Fiddes, for example, said, well, you have to appreciate I'm a Christian theologian. Well, that's precisely in a way why I invited Paul Fiddes to speak, and also his central focus on research in love and religion, which is very much part of a wider project here, and with Martin precisely because I know that he has done a lot of work in relation to classical forms of Islam, and in particular, the questions he picked up on around Christian biblical tradition and its interpretation by Muslims. And so thank you to both of you for responding out of those perspectives of work you're engaged in, but also for trying to, in that sense, be faithful to and portray accurately, which I think you have done, and what I've tried myself to do in the book, and out of all of that to pose some questions that I'll try and make some initial response to now, but maybe also leading into opening up into a wider discussion. Please, when we do that, not just kind of questions to me, because I think there are many people in the room here who have something themselves to contribute as a thought or an observation or an evaluation or a critique, not just when we get into that wider discussion, questioning me and what I think. That would be good if we have that wider discussion. But to try to respond initially by to one or two of the points, at least I might not manage. I've been trying to take notes. I may not manage to get through them all, but I'll pick out a number. I hope not the easy ones and leaving the hard ones. If I do that, then please, Paul and Martin, drag me back and say, you didn't respond to that one that was really tough, and make me do it, because we all have that human tendency to slide towards the easiest. Might even start with Martin's first. I'll start with Martin's, I think, and then work back to Paul's a little bit. I might flip between the two. Martin asked a very legitimate question about, in a sense, the scope of the interview work on which the two books are based. You're quite right, it was impossible, and indeed in the early phases of planning the project, I very much considered looking actually not so much at people who were former members of the movement and who had left, though that obviously is a legitimate area to look at. But I actually looking at, for example, in the Hizmet in Europe book, at public officials and their perceptions of understanding of evaluation of Hizmet in the various European countries. In the end, I think the reason I didn't end up doing either of those two things was a mixture of pragmatism, as you say. There's a limit to what one can do if one's going to do it thoroughly enough, rather than trying to attempt to do all possible angles and not doing any of them properly thoroughly. I think I also wanted to, as regards the question about, which wasn't Martin's question, but I've just touched on the question about kind of complete outsiders and insiders. I think I was very concerned to try, in a way, through both books, to explore the kind of religious tone, the religious feeling, as well as thinking that lies behind Hizmet and is also at Fethullah Gülen's heart. Partly because there are many sociological, but also in particular political science studies that seem to me, while having very valid things to contribute to understanding the movement and also Fethullah Gülen himself, seem to miss out on what actually, for as far as I can see, for Gülen for himself and for the vast majority of those who are inspired by his teaching, is actually this kind of dynamic religiosity that's at the heart of everything. And I didn't want to miss that out. With regard to people who might have left the movement and therefore have very critical voices towards it, in a way, actually, I picked up partly on that more in the other volume, because that was concerned more with people. I mean, this was focused more on Gülen himself, albeit in interaction with Hizmet. And the, particularly some of the debates in the Netherlands around Gülen and around Hizmet, what can be said of it, how it can be interpreted on multiple levels, including the criticism of it being in some context a kind of more cult-like structure and so on. These are things that I do try to engage with, but I haven't engaged with them in the book with what you might call first-person testimony, from those concerned. So I've tried to make clear I understand that's part of the picture, and I cite a number of works that come from that angle, including in relation to Gülen himself. The Turkish Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Diyanet's own book critiquing Gülen. And so I guess that's how I'm trying to approach that. But I think, you know, it's a legitimate question, but that's my kind of initial response to it. Picking up on the question of how, your last question, Martin, how Hizmet relates to other movements, that actually does form a section in one of the chapters in the other book, which I'm not, of course, expecting you to have read yet. But this has been, I think, an ongoing debate within Hizmet, and in a sense, I think, because of the upheavals following 2016 events in Turkey, has sharpened itself in more recent times, because when the movement was itself, when it had its own expansionary dynamic and its own, in a sense, logic that was pushing it forward, and its own wish to be distinctive, I think, in many ways, the question of the relationship with others was often, it seemed to me, more on the back burner. I know the movement was often challenged, certainly in the UK, by, well, you know, do you stand apart from other Muslims? How do you engage with other Muslims of all different kinds? And, you know, why are you not doing kind of intra-Islamic work, for example? Why do you stand outside of that? And I know that was a very live debate, particularly in the British context, over a number of years, into which I had, you know, quite some kind of close-up insight. So it is an important set of questions. It is touched on more in the other book. And just popping back briefly to the question about people outside the movement, I guess another reason in the end I didn't go into that was that I felt post-2016, in relation to the wide spectrum of those who are somehow in touch with, but may not any longer so define themselves as I am Hizmet, there's already a very, very wide spectrum of voices, critiques, and that sometimes the internal critique of those who kind of remain in touch, but not kind of saying, this is my primary label, can be as sharp, and in fact has become quite sharp in different forms of expression of that in public statements, as from those who've gone away and might have gone away for all kinds of different motivations, which one would then have to take into account in evaluating their critiques of the movement. So just popping back to that. I'm going to leap across to Paul Fiddy's briefly now at this point before coming back again to some of Martin's questions. Thank you, Paul, for always trying to remind me of my hidden theologian that probably is there whatever I say, I know. I guess what I was trying to do by making the kind of distinction I did, and I appreciate your response that, you know, theologies are not only to be understood as propositional collections and so on. What I guess I was trying to do in relation to the two books was that there is, for example, a very interesting study by a Dutch scholar, Pim Valkenburg, on renewing Islam by service, a Christian view of Fethullah Gülen that very explicitly brings to bear upon trying to understand Gülen's teaching and practice, a set of Christian starting points in terms of theological frameworks, symbols, etc. That isn't what I tried to do. That could have been what I might have done, but I chose not to do that. I think you described very, very well for me, and better than I managed to describe for myself, how you think I was trying to proceed in terms of this contextual thing and the multiple layers of that, and then you know, bringing questions to bear by myself becoming, in that sense, a participant in the conversation while not myself being a Hizmet person or indeed a Muslim. And I think, you know, you described that fantastically, and I look forward very much to reading, you know, the text of what eventually, by the way, these reviews will form part of a special edition of the Journal of Dialogue Studies, that together with the papers and responses in the coming weeks on Muslims in dialogue, Christians in dialogue, Jews in dialogue, humanists in dialogue, and these papers, the book reviews in that sense will also form part of that. So you'll all have chance later, this will be available online in the autumn, you'll all have chance to revisit both Paul's and Martin's and the other contributions today. I think, yeah, sorry, I've just lost my track there. So yes, this question about, again, I was interested, Paul picked out, you picked out, Paul, this, I can't remember my exact words, but where I was, in a sense, trying in the Gülen book to say, okay, you can understand lots of things historically, theologically, sociologically, contextually, but why certain things happen in people's lives, why movements develop, why they don't develop, etc. There are things which are not always totally explainable away in a reductionist sense. So I was trying to preserve, I guess, this space for engaging with a phenomenon, or engaging with a set of teachings and engaging with a person that didn't, as a prerequisite, say you can only engage, you can only understand this person according to, or their teaching according to the canons of secular academia, for example. So I was trying to keep open a possibility. And that very much goes back to also my experience I had when initially proposing to different publishers these two books. Because in a sense, the books are also tonally slightly different. So the European book is a lot more historical and, if you like, sociological. It presents things in that way. It tries to have a more evaluative thing and keep open these other questions. But when I first proposed that book to a different unnamed publisher, the reviewer responses I got were really quite interesting. But to me, they betrayed a very narrow approach to understanding phenomena that understand themselves, at least, to be religious, and what actually motivates people, what actually shapes people's lives. And in a kind of reductionist way that wanted to say, okay, well, you can understand this according to the balance of political forces in Turkey and how this emerged. And yeah, all of those things are very important, but I've always wanted to try and leave the door open to this, you can call it mysterious, maybe that's too much, but the contingent, or leave the contingency of things open to what it is that religious people themselves are trying to testify to. And Gülen's own understanding and interpretation, you can't understand it without seeing his kind of horizon on time, space, and infinity. It's not something that, oh, well, this is a leader who's trying to connect with various events in the world and say various things about them, and just from the sake of adapting to the world. No, it is very much this religious, call it transcendence perspective or whatever. And I guess I've tried to keep that somewhere alive in different ways in both books, but without being so, if you like, symbolically or theologically, or thematically, sorry, symbolically or thematically theological in the first book. Gülen and the Bible, popping back to Martin. That's a very interesting. I'm very interested you picked that up. It's not surprising. Brief advert. Martin has I think, 2 volumes, fantastic volumes of Muslim understandings, views, interpretations of what Christians call the Bible. Really important work. And I think you're correct, actually, about insofar as he undertakes hermeneutic of the Christian Bible, it is framed by some of these tropes that are kind of handed down in aspects of classical Islam and in a relatively unreflective way. So yes, the notion of the distortion of the Injil, one can find that present, and one also finds, but it's quite from what I can see anyway, from the body of work that I've been able to look at, there isn't a lot of engagement in that sense with the Christian sources in terms of the scriptures. So it's more of a bit of a sideshow. What was really interesting, actually, and Paul alluded to this in what happened when I was in the USA and spent time in the Golden Generation Retreat Center where Fethullah Gülen is present. At a certain point, I made a presentation of some gifts to him, including actually a book about the history of this college, as inspired, if you like, by religious dissent and offering educational opportunity. I thought this was a good thing to kind of give as a gift. But I also recited, as Paul alluded to, the Beatitudes, Jesus' teaching, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, because I felt, and this is where, I can't be a neutral observer in these things, I felt I wanted to acknowledge the human impact of being a wounded exile and what that means for him and for others in the movement. And the day afterwards, when I was interviewing some others who were around at that time, interestingly, they said to me, well, he wanted to know more about the Beatitudes, and I'd recited it to him in English, and contemporaneous Turkish translation has been given, and then they went and searched for a Turkish translation that was perhaps more reliable, and the message came back that, well, he was writing at the moment on what some Sufis said about Jesus and about love, but having heard the Beatitudes, he thought he ought to actually engage with, in that sense, Jesus's recorded words in the Christian scriptures in developing his thought. Now, I don't know actually what came out of that. I can't point to, well, here was an article that he actually wrote that's referenced back to the Beatitudes. I can't do that, but I thought that was an interesting little interaction that has something to say to the question Martin asked. But I think, broadly speaking, I think you're correct. And also this reading into the Christian scriptures of the presence of the Prophet Muhammad, which again is a very normal thing out of a lot of Muslim perspectives, which Christians find generally problematic. So I think that you can find. But the other thing I would say also about Gülen in relation to these kind of things, and particularly in relation to his understanding of and engagement with people of other than Muslim faith, and this comes back a bit to Paul's question, I think, about, was it Paul's about? No, it's Martin's about discouraging conversion. I think that Gülen has seriously developed his understanding of people of and also other religions, and in a way that you can trace throughout his life. I think there are early writings which are very different in tone and in emphasis than on more recent writings. And some of that comes about, I think, and indeed some of the people I interviewed argued this, who accompanied him on early visits to the USA before he eventually came about, actually through encountering people of other faiths, in a sense, outside the Turkish context, and then starting to evaluate maybe differently traditional understandings to which he was an inheritor. And it was precisely those new contexts that brought about the possibility of looking at things slightly differently. So I think the notion that you can, I mean, the phrase, what was the phrase? Nothing wrong with Christianity. I think it was that, yeah, I'd have to go back actually. I can't remember that one off the top of my head in the setting that came up. But I think the notion of trying to be as true as possible to the religious path that one is on, that, in my understanding, but I'm not a classical Islam scholar in the way that you are, is not a completely foreign notion historically, but certainly you know, the wish that people would embrace the path of Islam is more common in the Muslim world, just as it is among many Christians. But I think Gülen's partly his and the story that was recounted around that about a couple who wanted to or were interested in converting. I think part of that also has to be understood that sometimes in the religious world, people are attracted to something that they see as new for them, and they never really seriously engage with what they might have as part of their own inheritance. And the temptation then is, in a way, to slide over into something new and exciting without taking it seriously. I mean, I know sometimes, for example, in the intra-Christian context, people who wanted to become engaged with the Orthodox Christian Church in various different ways have often been discouraged in the same way that people who want to join the Jewish tradition, lots of different issues involved there in terms of biological inheritance and so on, are discouraged. So I think some of the discouragement is about, well, don't just think you can find all your answers here, just because you haven't engaged seriously elsewhere. So some of it, I think, is about that. It's almost like you might call it a tactical response to people who might want to move across from Christianity to Islam, more than a sort of this general statement there's nothing wrong with Christianity. I mean, I need to look back at that statement and the context of it properly to try and explain what I think he was saying about that. So perhaps at this point I'll just stop for now. I've still got a number of questions and points written down here on my piece of paper from both Paul and Martin. And as I say to both of you, if you think we don't pick those up sufficiently, I will, let's try in the course of things come back. But people have been sitting here, those who are sitting here in the room at least have been sitting for quite some time. Maybe they want to just wave around a little bit, and maybe we should then just open up into a wider discussion. But don't let me off the hook if I've wheedled myself off the hook.
Okay, well, we did have an official break at 4 o'clock, but I think maybe if we have a quick sort of 5-minute sort of shake our legs, but strictly no more than 5 minutes, and then we'll continue then with questions both in the room and remotely. Okay.
Yeah, okay, well, I think that's partly what I was trying to say there, that you could think, well, that looks more attractive. I like that, but without really. Yeah. Yeah. He was no, it's not his direct words. That's the person. Yes, it's the reporting by so it's not good at words, but I think actually, particularly if one reads this sentence, changing of a room and house, it couldn't be a change of house, and that's what I'm saying. But please, come in and say it. Make that point. It would be good, yeah. Because I couldn't immediately remember where.
I know your position.
I decided that because of the rule being like crap, I would send a copy of it to that. To make it a lot easier than.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, it was at the beginning when reopening up again, Sunni, as he looked up this thing about nothing wrong with Christianity.
Yeah.
So he's got something to say from the book. It actually isn't a direct quotation from Gülen. It's said by Muhammad Chesed in recounting the story of these two people. So it's a summarization. But actually, there's a, from what Martin highlighted, there's a missing bit which follows it, which came somewhat close to what I was saying there. That you don't just want to go with the bright and shiny new thing. I mean, it was already talked about changing rooms, but without changing inside. So it could pick up and make the bridge. So I came to see you and I said, would you? Thinking on my feet. But yeah, that would be a different experience for you to see. I mean, in the way that they, as we look at religious. This book, you could read it more as a historical what the issues that it is in Europe. That's more the tone and flavour.
This one you passed over.
Yeah, that's the only one at the moment. Right. The other should have arrived this morning, but it's
This is the one that's based on Europe.
Yeah, the other one is what I've just been talking about, what they critiqued about. But this is the one that after the coffee break,
And they actually betting capital in 1/6 traced. June. And one of the telephone where he explains to them what they did and how they changed by name.
We'll start in a few minutes.
Oh, yeah, well, conspiracy, yes, I didn't mention conspiracy, but that conspiracy is a big thing. Yes, oh, you've got to go to your English lessons soon. Oh, still.
I'm in Darwin. Still Darwin. So, Lisa, the middle sister, she's in
Yeah, so originally I thought I might only come back to the legal situation, but now back to so so when I can think ahead, my trains, I'll be in touch with you and sit down. I've seen you sent me today. We can sit down for an hour and commit together. We should have done that. Sorry, please read this COVID nice situation. Of course, yes. Yeah. Okay, so I'll be in touch.
Okay, folks, I think we will let this start. Right, okay. I'm not sure how strong the microphone is in the room, but in the past, when we've spoken from the room, it's not always audible for those who are working remotely. So if you have a point to make, I will try and summarize it. Well, try and summarize it for the benefit of those who are remote. Or alternatively, if you feel particularly brave, you can go to the podium and ask your question from there, because we know that it will get heard, although you'll also be seen, which you may not want to have. But I believe that we have a point of clarification from Sally.
Yeah, actually, it's not a clarification from directly from myself. It's from Paul's book.
Yeah.
So just to contextualize the statement, which is from Gülen. It seems to be quoted directly from Gülen, but in the book it's not. There is nothing with Christianity. That phrase. So actually, Muhammad Çetin, one of the volunteers of the movement and one of the students of Gülen, I suppose, he knew a couple of adults who visited Gülen to say that they would like to be Muslims and they would like to give up Christianity. And Muhammad Çetin reported that Gülen's response to them was, so these are not the exact words maybe, that there's nothing wrong with Christianity, there's nothing wrong with Jesus, peace be upon him. If you have such a thing, you shouldn't give up anything from your own culture and belief. Otherwise, these are the same things. So therefore, because of this, this is what Paul comments after that. In relation to the possibility of changing religion from Christianity to Islam, Gülen says that, this is what Gülen says, you shouldn't, this could be a changing of a room in the house, but it couldn't be change of the house in a sense. So this is the exact context of the quotation from the book.
Could we have the page number?
It's actually on page 105. Yeah, it's the Fethullah class teaching.
So thank you to Sally for helping my memory, because I couldn't remember exactly. So in effect, that's a summarization by Muhammad Çetin of his memory of something Gülen rather than a direct quotation. But I think what I was trying to say is, you know, the excitement sometimes, or the attractive, or the seduction, you could almost say, of another religion can sometimes be one that is almost false, because you think, ah, that's a nice new room, I'm going to go in and do it. But you don't really inhabit the room. It's just the newness that is attractive. So that was actually, the Gülen's own words were about that. Yeah, so it's, but you know, it's a good question to ask, and it raises wider issues, obviously.
Okay, and we have a question from Farid, who has probably not come back yet, but I'll read it out. So I think it's an interesting question. That both Fidesz and Whittingham seem to be in search of a systematic theologian in Gülen. Are not we rather dealing with an organic theologian who thinks while he's on the go, so to say? So Paul, maybe you could take that, and then we'll then sort of see what Martin and Paul makes. No, actually, let's go with Paul first. Paul.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think Farid may have gone actually from his later comment, but
Yeah,
if he hasn't,
so, yeah.
But if he hasn't, that's great. We can enter into some discourse with him. No, I wasn't looking for a systematic theologian in Gülen at all. My point was that Paul, despite his slightly negative comments about theology, and I think he's right about a lot of conventional Christian theology, but he himself was acting, I thought, in the book in a theological kind of way, which I think he's admitted, in order to tidy up, as it were, or systematize a little Gülen's thought, particularly in his proposal that that the heart of it could be seen in this combination of love and the human. You know, this was an attempt, as it were, to bring a lot of disparate material together. And that this really was the basis of the Sufi idea of the ideal human, or the perfect human. And therefore, I was just raising some questions about what the implications of that might be, for example, to the kind of understanding of a difference between corporeal and spiritual love. What sort of implication would that have if one were looking for this combination of love and the human? So I was wanting to push Paul a bit more, as it were, along the line that he was beginning to follow. So it was really my comment on Paul rather than what I was trying to do in reviewing Gülen's thought as I gleaned it through Paul, but also through, I have read his work, some of his work on Sufism and the Love and Tolerance book. So I have read some Gülen, but I'm by no means expert in knowledge of his thoughts. But I wonder if Paul would like to respond to that. Why did he want to, as it were, why did Paul himself want to bring Gülen's thought together into these two principles of love and the human? I mean, what did Paul hope to do with this? That's the sort of question I was asking. And Are there not implications?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly just on the, Gülen is systematic theology, he's not, and he never portrays himself to be, and, you're not going to get a however many volume church dogmatics from Karl from Gülen, and I don't think those who are inspired by him are either going to ever write anything in a sense that's systematized like that, in that kind of way. I think in a way one should understand, indeed, there's a Methodist Christian interpreter of Gülen from the States called Sidney Griffiths, who argues that one needs to understand him primarily actually in terms of being a preacher more than being a kind of professional theologian in the sense of a lecturer or something like that. The dynamic is his preaching exposition of things. That also connects with this in the proper sense of preaching, or in the preaching you might find in the black majority churches. That's to say articulation and response, not just sending it over there in the congregation sitting, and either the actual interaction, the preaching engagement, the on the hoof, almost also one could say, rather like Charles Wesley on horseback, not settled and articulating in each new place with each new group of people. That, in a way, is the image for me of Gülen as an articulator and a developer of tradition, rather than one who takes, a set of key ideas, symbols, concepts, and then works out in a kind of logical way their relationship to one another. Now, in regard to Paul's question he's pushing with me about why, I thought, okay, out of that, can one bring anything that one can speak in a more general sense of that? Yes, I wanted to do that. I didn't, and I think Paul's correct to say, it's often a failure of mine. I will identify some idea, give it maybe some articulation in a pregnant phrase or two, and not always follow it through as much as it maybe deserves to have done. That's partly me and my failings and my own intellectual weaknesses or laziness. It's also, though, I think, because in just taking these two things, love and the human, and maybe mediated with freedom, I see them as keys, rather than as hermeneutical keys, rather than as something that is already out. Indeed, precisely the point is their implications are not yet fully articulated. And it's in understanding that these are the keys to understand, as I think it is, what Gülen is, these are the keys to understanding Islam, that allow then the development of Islam in praxis to be taken forward by those who use these keys, rather than me sort of pontificating on, well, that's putting it negatively, or even trying to say, well, what I think that might then lead to. So it's trying to focus on what unlocks Gülen. And again, at the end of the book, that therefore this idea, he's not passing on a deposit in any sense. And it would be a mistake, I think, though, one of the difficulties always is being an interpreter of the movement. Who am I to interpret it? I stand outside it. What's my right to do it? Well, I have as much right as anybody else in one sense. But I think there's not a deposit there to hand on. There is a methodology, and the methodology relates to these two important, or (3) with this mediating thing on freedom, hermeneutical keys. Because I think when you go back, both historically, even though there are very traditionalist locked things, for example, about understanding the Christian Bible, but when you go back, and also when you come through to the present and through the different times and places, I think these keys have been fairly constant. And that's what I guess I was trying to bring out. But also Paul's point about dualism, I think, is a very, I must admit that hadn't struck me as much as it probably ought to have done. And it's something that I would like to go back and look at rather more, because I suspect, yes, the language does very much have this dualistic sense, although, again, in kind of pregnant terms, I refer to Gülen as an embodied teacher, but what is this embodiment? What does that mean? In one sense, of course, in Islamic spirituality, it's there in the simplest of acts, namely how one prostrates in prayer. You know, there is an embodiment in the way that not in all traditions of Christianity is there that embodiment. But I think, yeah, this sense of Platonic dualism that might underlie some articulations of, you know, the attainment of the angelic and so on. That's an important area to come back to. I don't think, I didn't question him on that, and it would be interesting to go back to his already published writings, or if I get a future opportunity actually to talk more about that. So thank you for that point.
Thank you. Before I open up to anyone else, I just want to just pose maybe a question out of my ignorance. But if Gülen then, as you've explained, is not a systematic theologian, would it be too Christian to use the term a practical theologian, or is that just doesn't work when you translate it from one tradition to another?
I think it might be a useful terminology. And I think, you know, one of the things also in the other book, particularly, I try to do is there can be a sense also within the discourse within the movement to exceptionalize Gülen and exceptionalize the movement, whereas actually sometimes some broader concepts, although practical theology does have a very Christian rather than more general thing about, you know, how religious movements develop and what their dynamics are. But I think it can be helpful to, you know, as long as one doesn't push it too far, to apply such terminologies, because it can open up another way of thinking about it, perhaps also for those in the movement. Yeah.
Any questions? Take our friend first.
Right, okay, thank you. A couple of points. Number one, I mean, you mentioned modernity, and Gülen is trying to steer away from that debate. So it is one of the crucial areas of contention and contestation in the Muslim world, especially since the 19th century. I think there is an issue because something maybe is partly true, that modernity is generally seen in the Muslim world as westernization.
Yeah.
And westernization does not mean just technological advancement or academic or intellectual achievements of the West, but seen in the larger religious context. I mean, for example, we talk about colonialism.
Yeah.
But when we talk about colonialism, we're talking about British colonialism, French, Dutch, and to some extent Russian colonialism. But beyond that, I think we need to go back to the Muslim memories.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the Portuguese and Spanish, connection with modernity and their relationship with the Muslim world, which I think came back in the 19th century, reminding Muslims that Europe generally meant Christian, and in that sense meant Andalusia.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think there are these long-term, which Al-Qaeda and such groups tried to exploit, but these memories came back. This is where crusades and Inquisition and expulsions from Sicily, from Spain, and then how the Portuguese and the Spanish, took control of Indian Ocean, and how the Muslims were mistreated until, the 19th century. There are these kind of memories. So I think that issue is, and maybe Gülen is aware of this pitfall, that if you use modernity in a very uncritiqued way, it could raise issues. I mean, this is what Sayyid Ahmad Khan faced, and this is what I think Jamaluddin Afghani was deeply worried about, and this is what Abduhu in Egypt faced. So I think this is a dilemma. The second question was about maybe even in Shia Islam, for example, you know, I mean, we have maybe this this issue of leadership, religious leadership, somehow sorted. I mean, amongst Ismaili Muslims, we have Aga Khan, Bora Muslims, we have Bora Mahdi, and in Asana Ashari, which is the majority Muslim, you have Ayatollahs in Najaf, and you have Ayatollahs in Qom, though they still have problems. But I think like what you mentioned and what Martin mentioned there, I think it is a problem or a challenge, ongoing challenge of leadership within Sunni Islam. And I think this is where, I mean, lots of people, especially, you know, in more recent times, 200 years or so, people have claimed leadership and they have been challenged. So to me, I think Gülen's opposition would come from that section. That on one hand, Sunni Islam does not accept, you know, hierarchical leadership. And the Sunnis generally say that Islam is different from Christianity and Judaism or even Hinduism because it doesn't have priesthood. Though we know historically Islam did develop priesthood, but Sunni Islam is not comfortable and it's too diffused. So there are people who would say, all right, let's follow Walushi, let's follow Sayyid Qutb, let's follow Sayyid Maududi. But then there are Muslims who say, all right, they're making lots of sense, but this is not in the very grain of Sunni Islam to have somebody. And this is where I think Farid Ishaq's question, I can understand where he's coming from when he says, are we trying to define Gülen as a theologian, which may not fit well with the Sunni tradition?
I think that's fair. One thing I didn't really take the opportunity, it was in my notes right at the beginning of the project, but again, either through time or whatever, but to have explored, when I had the opportunity of meeting Gülen, to explore with him also his understanding of Shia traditions. I didn't get there, but it would be something I think that would be fascinating to do. I don't know of anybody who's really done that, and I may be missing some part of the literature, but that would be an interesting thing to do. I mean, he is critical of, in that sense, Iranian state formations, what I loosely can call theocratic in that sense, as a model, strongly critical of that. But as for the Shia tradition more broadly and how that operates and what his understanding of that is, or what it has to offer either to Islam more generally or to the world, I don't know. Actually, it'd be, if anybody here has contribution on that, please make it. It would be interesting to know, or maybe somebody can do a new project. Your other point about colonialism and so on, I think arguably one of the interesting things that maybe has some reason for why somebody like Fethullah Gülen can emerge, and why something like Hizmet can emerge in time and space, is that Turkey, unlike the vast majority of other Muslim majority countries, was not in that sense directly colonized in the sense that large parts of the Muslim world were. So the historical experience is different there in some ways, and that the relationship with modernity is also where there's a conflict and tension. It's almost internally inbuilt. It is also that way, of course, in other Muslim majority countries. But the complete externality of the modernity along with a colonial project is not something that in the same way as in large swathes of, and that might have some bearing, I think, on why and how it's possible for this kind of phenomenon to have emerged in a Turkish setting when perhaps it didn't emerge in other settings.
But these colonial powers were the traditional opponents and, you know, of Ottoman Empire. So even if Turkey, if Anatolia was not colonized, most of the Ottoman Empire was. Whether we talk of North Africa, later on Egypt, I mean, Arabian Peninsula, Syria, or Balkans. So I think Turkey is a very interesting case. That maybe Anatolia was not colonized. Maybe
the modern
Kemal Atatürk felt that it was going to be colonized and he reacted to it. But I think the areas which made the Ottoman Empire did come under colonial control,
Yeah.
under France,
Good point.
under Britain. So in that sense, I think Ottoman or Turkey was not an exception. I mean, one could say the same thing about Afghanistan, that Afghanistan was never colonized.
Yes.
William Dalrymple goes, I mean, George Byron goes, a former history student, 1933, goes into Afghanistan from Iran. It says, finally, I'm in Afghanistan, which was never colonized. But it wasn't colonized.
If I can come in there, Paul may remember I've done doctoral work on Shiism,
Yes.
and I've advanced this in connection with the Gulen and Hizmet movement. The whole basis in Turkey was the radical change to a secular state, which covered significant decades of development until Islamist groups began to emerge into the public arena yet again in the 1950s, post World War II, and the end of Turkish neutrality and access into NATO and Europeanization. So Gülen took the opportunity and represents a reaction to that, and part of the Islamization or re-Islamization, the pietization of Turkish spiritual life through a Sunni Islamic expression. Now, there is considerable work to be done on this. I agree that Gülen is not a systematic theologian. He's more of a devotionalist thinker, and advances that into the public arena.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, Paul.
I think possibly our very last question before we go for coffee. Professor Jørgen, no question. Okay. In that case, I think we'll probably take the opportunity then to go for coffee. Okay, so we've got a 30-minute break. If you go into the dining hall, so if you go out here, then go across the quad, the dining hall would be coffee, tea, and juice, and we start again at 4:30. So thank you to Professor Paul Bidens and Dr. Martin Whittingham for your excellent contribution. So we hope that you can remain with us. Thank you. Right, okay, folks.
Yeah, good.
Folks, okay, so we're going to start again before we invite Professor Jørgen. Before, I thought it'd be good like to give 5 to 10 minutes for Paul just to summarize the most salient bits of the second book that you didn't get to, which obviously is now what we will be discussing. So, you need to share the screen again.
Yes. So click on again.
Where is it? Oh, it's down here.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll attempt to do this very quickly. Sorry. Okay. So, thank you, and hello to anybody who's just joining us after the break and wasn't part of the thing before. I'll attempt to do this very briefly, with apologies that I won't talk about the kind of complementarity of the book or the methods of approach, because those who have been with us all along will have heard that in relation to the other book. So I'm kind of skipping over that. Except that just to note this phrase I use, the politics of naming. Now, I'm very conscious in writing this book that, you know, whatever words one uses about movements or phenomena of this kind, they're heavily loaded with different kinds of eras. And there is no way around this. You simply have to choose something and justify why you chose it. Whether you call something Hizmet, whether you call them volunteers, whether you call them, or whether you, whatever label you use, movement, all these words are heavily loaded. And I try and explore a bit about that, what I call the politics of naming, by situating all of this in kind of a wider literature engagement. So we'll skip on past that. So this book is very much more historically located, and it has more to say about its focus is on Europe, but it starts off in Turkey and the origins in Turkey, but particularly with the three themes that operate throughout different manifestations of Hizmet, organizationally and structurally. So they are to do with education, to do with dialogical engagement with conflicts, and to do with poverty relief. And those three things, in a way, have a connection backwards in terms of teaching lineages through Fethullah Gülen to Said Nursi. So there is an inheritance there that's acknowledged by Gülen and within the movement. In that sense, it's not the origin of the movement that doesn't have these three things, but these three things become distinctive of how one finds the movement's focus and aims of its energies in different manifestations, both in Turkey at the beginning, and that's why this chapter is focused on that. But then as the movement also finds itself in different European countries, one finds these things re-emerging with a certain degree of resonance between them, but also not an absolute repetition, distinctive developments as time goes on. So, I won't here expand on anything about in each of the countries, but just to say a big chunk of this book, those are the countries in which, or in relation to which interviews took place. Obviously, there are more countries in Europe. I'm very conscious that Central and Eastern Europe is missing from that. So if somebody says, what more research can be done, as I was just asked in a journalistic interview a few minutes ago, I'd say that's a big area of research. What about Hizmet in Poland? What about Hizmet in many of the Balkan countries? What about Hizmet, or could have asked, in Ukraine or Russia? But now the situation is, but that's a whole area which may be different. And it's important to understand that. But I couldn't do a half job on that. Actually, at the very beginning of the project, a project was going to focus actually on Hizmet in Central and Eastern Europe, because nobody else has really, well, not nobody, but there's been very little published work on that. But for various reasons, it didn't carry forward in that way. But I think in future that remains something to look at. So you can skip over that, but that's just so you know that where the main focus of the book has been. So I could talk about this phrase I use, decentering from Turkey. So first generation of Hizmet, second generation of Hizmet, the relationship backwards and forwards with people coming and going, the financial relationship, all of those things was strong and important. One couldn't understand in any sense Hizmet initiatives in wider European countries without understanding the connection to Turkey. But obviously the events around 216 and the subsequent events from that in terms of the persecution of Hizmet people and so on means that there is this challenge how what has become in the meantime, in this sense, a case study of a global phenomenon, but here focused on Europe, how does it go forward when no longer centered backwards into Turkey? What are the implications of that? Do people still want, ideally, if it was possible, to reconstruct something in Turkey or not? Or is the future now totally seem to be different because of this disruption, this, again, a word I use a lot in both books, trauma, and this decentering that accompanies that. So I kind of try to trace that a bit, both in the Turkish context there, what was the relationship between the present governing party in Turkey and Hizmet. I kind of call it walking in tandem, question mark. That's to say, there are those, particularly political scientists, who argue for a very much more close organic relationship at an earlier period that then is followed by a dramatic falling out. I would read the situation as being more to do with having common strategic goals at a certain point in time, namely civilian and not military governments, namely an orientation towards the European Union, which were characteristic of an early phase of the AKP in Turkey and were present within Hizmet, and the opportunity for religion to come out from under a certain kind of strongly laicistic secularism, that ordinary Muslims should be able to participate in public life in Turkey. These were common themes up to a certain point. So I talk about it, therefore, as walking in tandem rather than, some call it strategic alliances and other things, but that's my terminology. But this began to break down, and I won't sort of try and unpack that now because that's also about Turkey more than Europe. But eventually, this results in Europe in what I call a three-layered Hizmet. So if we click onto the next screen, which I'll come to in 1 second. So by three-layered, I'm talking about the original Hizmet people, original migrants in many cases, and all the second generation of them. And then that's a kind of first layering. And then there's the emergence in lots of different European countries then of another generation of leadership, somewhat different than coming from a migrant background directly. And now, since 2016, also differentiated among themselves are people who've come from Turkey out of that context, fleeing from that context as asylum seekers or refugees, either officially in that category or on various forms of work permit that allow people not to be present in Turkey, that are not formally asylum seekers, but actually it's a mechanism not to be there. And the experiences in these three layers of, for example, big questions that I call new foci for old questions. So many of these questions and issues have always been there in relation to Hizmet, but on the other side of 2016, they're intensified, they're turbocharged, in a way that makes what might have been over 10, 15, 20 years, quotes unquote, natural process of development in relation to some of these questions becomes very much more sharp, existential in the moment. So these questions have always been there. And I say, if I was writing about Hizmet before 2016, Hizmet in Europe, I would have used the same headings probably, but post 2016, they're new foci for old questions. So I try and explore those, this dynamic between seeing Hizmet as terrorists and Hizmet people trying to portray what they can offer against the use of Islam for purposes of terror. The whole question of the relationship between Turkishness in the origins of Hizmet and what it means beyond that. The whole question of the relationship between structures and individual charisma, how things operate organizationally, structurally. For example, with basic things like money. How does that operate? Does it operate in the informal sense, in the way that in many Muslim Islamic societies, exchange of money happens, or is it, within fully accounted systems and Western understandings, and all these kind of questions relating to civil society, politics, and the state, against a background where one might say, okay, Hizmet achieved remarkable levels of institutionalization in various forms of Turkish life, from banking through to media and so on and so forth. What does it mean when all that's no longer there? But in a country like Germany, where normally the expectation is that religious groups play a part in the corporate structures of society, social services and so on and so forth. Against the background of what happened in Turkey, I explored in the chapter, particularly around Germany, interviewees who say, well, you know, we got too sucked into some of that stuff, maybe in Turkey. Now the German government's asking us, you know, come and work with us in a kind of corporatist way. Do we need to be worried about that? Should we? But then on the opposite pole is, do we become kind of, in Christian terminology, pietistic and retreat into our own little religious circles where we can feel safe and secure and not engage with taking the risk, the ethical risks sometimes of actually institutionalizing in new forms in other kinds of society? It's a big question. It's not only a question for Hizmet, and this is one of the things I think I've tried to bring out in this book, that many of the questions that Hizmet face are not only new foci for old questions, but are in one form or another questions that religious movements and groups of all kinds face. Hizmet faces it in its own way, through its own clothing, if you like. But many of the dynamics of movements, how they develop, what happens to them, where they go to, what kind of conflicts, what kind of debates are not uncommon in other groups. So, and the big question around gender is also there as relating to other Muslims, which came up in the last session. Click on quick. So, towards the end of the book, therefore, I also talk in sense of past and present, kind of juxtaposition of continuing values, different expressions of those values. So trying to go back to this education, dialogical, poverty relief thing, and how has that become transformed, and also what might be the future trajectories, which nobody can, of course, know, which are debated, the subject of quite vigorous debate. I hope I bring that out in the book within the movement. And in particular, I say the one at 6.4, quite interestingly, I think there's this, of course, poverty exists very strongly, even in this country, where now we know there are more food banks than there are McDonald's. And what does that tell us about this country and the task of relieving poverty that needs to be done? But I think what has also happened within Hizmet is, in a sense, that third strand has pushed out into a broader engagement with the human in terms of human rights. And I think that's come about partly because of the direct oppression and persecution experience of Hizmet people, which has made many people think again about parts and aspects of Turkish history which they never reflected upon in Turkey because it was part of what happened to the Armenians, for example. If something can happen to us, will we see something different in relation to them? And what about what's going on in other parts of the world, and how out of our trauma can we do something positive and constructive, maybe? So, and right at the end is this whole dynamic question that hovers always, what about when Fethullah Gülen is no longer there? So kind of Hizmet in Europe with and or without Fethullah Gülen. And what I want to argue, I think, in the book as a whole is that I think that Hizmet exhibits, despite this traumatization that is very real and very deep, and has profoundly affected many individuals in Hizmet and also structural organizations and capacities, that there is something still about confident Islamic engagement rather than reactive Islamic engagement. That is a strand that I at least identify going through, that has something to do with self-criticism, though it has its limits and debates within Hizmet about how far that goes or not. And therefore, right at the end here, trying to argue, okay, maybe the future, and it's a kind of a mirror of what I was saying in the other book about Gülen. It's not about a deposit of teachings that come through and then are taken forward, but about 2 or 3 hermeneutical keys for how to live creatively, confidently, appropriately, humbly as Muslims in a contemporary world. And here, the temptation, of course, is always to reproduce things. That was a temptation, and the difficulty and challenge for Hizmet in early years in Europe. You know, what do we do? Oh, well, we'll learn from what others did, and we maybe just reproduce it. I'm being very crude here. But the difference between what I'm calling copy-paste and contextual reinvention, you know, is quite a profound one. And the challenge for Hizmet going forward is, can it achieve that contextual reinvention? I think, is that my I can't remember. Yes, so that's, I'll stop at that point and be very happy if we click there one more, you'll see the two colleagues who are going to respond to this. Thank you very much.
I now invite Professor Jørgen Nielsen.
I was just going to say, challenge you to pronounce the first name.
Jørgen Nielsen was emeritus from my old alma mater, University of Birmingham. Got Birmingham University.
Right. Thanks very much for the invitation. I've read the book with great interest. And I do have to say congratulations. Anybody who ventures to write a book on this subject is asking for trouble. And
no more volatility.
there will be those who will say he's caused trouble. I would suggest that it's, on my reading anyway, probably the, I don't know whether objective is the right word, probably the most neutral, engaged study of a major study of Hizmet Gülen that I've seen. Among colleagues, both in the Yearbook of Muslims in Europe and on the Journal of Muslims in Europe, the moment Gulen and Hizmet comes up in somewhere, sparks fly. And sparks will fly on this one. I mean, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to find someone. We are going to review it in the Journal of Muslims in Europe, but it's going to be extremely difficult to find someone who will give you a fair hearing, quite honestly. And especially when they discover that it's been funded in part by the Dialogue Society, a lot of people will simply write it off. This is a front. It's been done very cleverly. There are critical questioning bits in the middle and every now and then, but basically it's an apologia for Hizmet and Gülen. You can hear it all coming.
Yeah.
I often find it interesting how a book or an article or a speaker is attacked because he or she is funded by or linked to a certain group. In European, including British, and I will, in spite of all the facts, continue to include Britain in Europe, there is a kind of blindness to the fact that an enormous amount of our research is funded by the state or by the European Commission. Why has there been so much research in the last 20 years on Islamic extremism and terrorism? That's not because, in the first instance, not because we've all suddenly become obsessed with the subject. It's because the state has wanted the research and is paying for it. So it's not just the Dialogue Society. So we really have to look at all published research, including this one, in terms of the content, in terms of the academic approach, of the critical questions that are asked, rather than just dismiss it because it's been funded by the Dialogue Society. If we would do that, we should just dismiss most of what academics publish funded by the research councils or the European Research Council. My approach to the book has been very much in terms of setting it in a wider context. And of course, the first bit of context is the whole field of immigration and settlement, which is why I think it makes sense for the book to focus primarily on Western Europe, because that's where the Muslim immigration and settlement has been. To bring in Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, to a certain extent Greece, would have distracted. It would have opened up other issues and broken up the coherence. A separate book on Gülen in Eastern Europe makes sense, but it is not the same as Gulen and Hizmet in Western Europe. It can actually be an interesting book. I'm interested to see how Paul talks about these three layers of the Gülen community, which in many ways matches with the general history of Muslim immigration into Western Europe. There's the layer of migrant labor, there's the layer of family reunion, we're talking about the 60s and the 70s here, and then there's the following generations, the children of the immigrants. And then in a sense, from the 80s and on, the arrival of refugees from Muslim countries represent a degree of disruption. An obvious example is Germany, where primarily Turkish migration had settled. It had developed its organizations, not without interference. And the children were coming through, etc., etc. Then suddenly in 2015, the Syrians come in big numbers. Fortunately, the level of education and resources, personal resources that the Syrians bring with them is quite high by refugee standards. So they're able to, despite all the obstacles, they're able to settle and find their feet. The Hizmet, parallel to that, of course, is the 2016 refugees. Coming at a time when Hizmet has gone through this period of immigration, settlement, next generations, they're beginning to, the horrible word, integrate. I apologize for it, but it's the shortest way to put it. And each and one of you will probably integrate in a different manner. But then come the refugees from 2016. Interesting group. They tend to be the professionals. From the judiciary, the police, the military, schools, universities, etc., etc. So in a sense, they come in with all the resources that the first generation of immigrants on the whole did not have. But they disrupt because they come with a very Turkish-centered view on the world and their future. And so you have a tension developing there. It's a question of what the existing Turkish Hizmet communities can do to persuade the refugee communities that their experience is actually worth taking on board, and for the refugees not just to go ahead and impose their own. And Paul talks about the decentering, we just did now. It's very interesting that as well, because we've also seen that in a more general field of European Muslim immigration and settlement. I remember in 1982, when the Christian phalangists in Lebanon massacred Palestinian refugees in the refugee camps in Sabra and Shatila. I happened to be visiting the Birmingham Central Mosque on the following Friday, and a collection was taken. but that was the last we heard of it. That was it. There was no interest in follow-up. The elements in the community who kind of led the discourse were still primarily concerned with Kashmir. Less than 10 years later, with the development of the war in former Yugoslavia, Bosnians in particular, a new generation has been activated, is being activated. It had already started in connection with the Rushdie affair. I remember Muslim community leaders in Birmingham telling me that all these young people in the anti-Rushdie demonstrations in Birmingham were people they had never seen in the mosque. And over the following half dozen years with Bosnia, and then towards the end of the 90s, the fighting in Kosovo, it was the aid projects, the support projects of young Muslims, that young Pakistanis in this case, on the whole, were driving to provide support and aid for the victims of the war in Bosnia. It was these aid projects that were bringing young Muslims into conscious Islam, if you like. Subsequently to that, they started attending the mosques. It wasn't the mosque leadership. There was this decentering. Suddenly, other things than Kashmir mattered. In the first instance, Bosnia, Sudan, Chechnya, and you can complete the list. One of the things that interests me in particular about Hizmet is its expressed commitment to dialogue. When this started in the 80s, this was very unusual among Muslim organizations. We had local dialogue projects set up in Britain, in Germany, in France, and certainly the Netherlands were leaders in this generally. I remember attending a founding meeting of a German Christian-Muslim Dialogue Association in Pforzheim, of all places. That was in the late 80s, as late as that. And what these early dialogue projects were looking for was cooperation and support in relations with the local authorities, in terms of access to public funding support, project support, and so on. It was quite clear from very early on that Hizmet's interests in dialogue went beyond that. And I think particularly my Danish experience and the dialogue forum Mustafa in a country where the right-wing media and politics were effectively hunting immigrants and above all Muslims. Whenever the Danish People's Party opinion polls began to sag by 2 or 3%, they would start a new campaign against Muslims. And within 3 or 4 days, the opinion polls would start catching up again and they would ease off. My wife, who is a Syrian Armenian and who understood a bit of Danish with me, after 2 or 3 days of these kind of reactions to the Danish People's Party, she would say, didn't we do that in Birmingham 15 years ago? And to a certain extent, yeah, we were about 15 years ahead of most of Europe at the time, not because Britain was so much better, it was simply a generation shift. There's an indication that Hizmet were very quick to adapt to local differences. And Paul describes it well in the book, the difference between Germany, the Netherlands, France, and interestingly, Spain and Portugal, where the community size and community diversity is such that there is much more diverse engagement. Germany is a problem because of the dead weight of the DNF on Turkish Muslim organizations. First coming through in 1980 after the military coup, when the new military government activates the DNF with millions of extra dollars, and the expansion of DNF control over Turkish mosques in Germany. And then, of course, you get the repeat growth of Turkish government interference, where DNF is a very significant tool in getting things, or attempting to getting things under control in Germany and elsewhere as well. I expect that, let's be honest, this is not a private gathering. I would not be at all surprised if there's somebody listening in, as a result of which those of you who are not already on the lists may very well be. And I'd be very surprised if Paul is allowed back into Turkey for the time being. That's the kind of world that we live in, and we're not Hizmet activists. For the Hizmet activists, it's seriously threatening. At one point, Paul gets into the question of transparency. Now, this is something that affects not only Hizmet, and not only Muslim organizations, in fact, around Europe. To an extent, all voluntary associations, all NGOs, but especially those which are not European in origin. The charity commissions are doing a job in this country. We want to see your accounts. Who is paying? Who is supporting it? In Austria, they've gone so far as to ban foreign financial support to Muslim organizations in Austria. Now, I haven't figured out quite yet how the DNet is organizing this. Because as far as I understand it, DNet support has not been cut off just like that. But something's going. And so some organizations, and in some countries, Hizmet is among them, they say they take the decision to be transparent. What are we about? What are we doing? What are our objectives? Who supports us? Where do we get our finances from? And so on. But then the next time there's some public moral outburst or about things Islamic, suddenly that transparency will be turned around against you. And there is a dimension of this, and it's not just Hizmet, it's all Muslim organizations and many others. It's a no-win situation. You do one thing and you get attacked. You do something else, the opposite, and you get attacked for that. And especially for Hizmet, you get caught in policy tensions, especially after 2016, where governments are pulled in different ways. Some governments stand up to Turkish government pressure. To an extent, some European governments have also been put under serious pressure from the Egyptian government to ban any kind of organizational movement that's to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. Some governments have been reasonably honorable and said, look, this is none of your business, we'll take care of this. But other governments are hemming and hawing. I haven't checked the last report of the German Internal Security Agency, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. Is Hizmet on their list of organizations being under observation? Milli Görüş was for a very long time.
I don't believe it is. In the book, I do quote the head of the service as saying that Turkey has tried to persuade us, but we are not yet persuaded as the formulation. We see Hizmet as
there's that
civil society.
There's that dangerous word yet.
Yeah, I know. Yes, it's a careful formulation.
Yeah. But it's interesting with the dialogue forum in Denmark that it has managed to establish its trustworthiness with the authorities to the extent that they give an annual prize to someone who has made a special contribution to dialogue. And it's usually, not always, it's usually some Danish figure, not Muslim. Minister of Foreign Affairs was presented with it once. A university lecturer was presented with it on another occasion. To that extent, Hizmet faces the same kind of pressures that other Muslim organizations face in various ways. In the first instance, more broadly after 9/11, where we had this sudden interest in homegrown imams. I remember before 9/11, there were a number of occasions when Muslim organizations in various European countries were approaching governments to see if they could have government funding for their training of their imams. Much like in some European countries, there is government funding for the training of priests and ministers. And the response from governments was not okay. And suddenly after 9/11, there was a 180-degree shift, and politicians started talking about needing to encourage the creation of homegrown imams. Even the French are talking about and trying to get European Commission support for an imam training program, multinational. Behind all of it, of course, there are ordinary Muslims. You mustn't forget the ordinary Muslims who are just trying to make their daily living under the radar, trying to see children and grandchildren through adulthood and successful careers. And in many ways, if you start looking at it from that angle, the situation in much of Western Europe is actually surprisingly positive against what one might expect. There is a pushback from young Muslims, especially those who have been successful in education. They're not a small minority. According to the 2011 census, something like 30% of young Muslims are doing well in education. I mean, further education, further and higher. There are significant proportions who are not getting anywhere, but there are significant proportions that are doing well. And despite the constant slaps around the face, they're resistant, they're pushing back without getting into controversy, without getting into violence. Remember some years ago, not that many years ago, there was a murderous attack on a gay bar in Florida. There were supporting vigils in a number of European and including British cities. You know, it's stunning to see the television report in the evening and the local television in the West Midlands filming from this vigil in support of the victims of the attack on the gay bar in Florida. There were a number of headscarf Muslim women there supporting the vigil against the attack on the gay bar. And young people, this is across the continent, young people are becoming more and more active in interreligious relations and community activities across the religious and ethnic divides. A final word about issues of organization. Towards the end of the book, Paul quotes, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, Jørgen or Jørgen? Jørgen, who identified the main trajectory as having been that of what he called a group of listeners who, quote, they have become followers, have transformed into being a local congregation, a congregation growing into a national community, a community expanding to be a comprehensive international organization of volunteers and stakeholders that can neither be defined as a religious sect or domination, although it is religiously informed. For some reason, it reminds me of the 1939 statement from the Conference on Muslim Brotherhood trying to identify, describe itself briefly. A Salafi message, a Sunni way, a Sufi truth, a political organization, an athletic group, a cultural educational union, an economic company, and a social idea. I suspect a lot of Hizmet people would be able to sign to some of that, clearly not the Salafi way. In many ways, it strikes me that Hizmet still functions, and I think Paul indicates that as well, in the organization and form of a number of traditional Sufi orders. At one level, apparently tightly organized and controlled, but at another level, amorphous, fluid, and ever shape-shifting to fit a new environment. Organizational academics sometimes use the term fuzzy organization about this. And I think that fits the Hizmet movement as a whole. What confuses the observer here is the difficulty, almost impossibility, of pinning a movement such as Hizmet down, especially from the perspective of the European government observer. Our environment in Northern Europe, in particular, is dominated by deeply rooted bureaucratic institutions underpinned by legislation and bylaws. I'm tempted to identify this as a North European Protestant phenomenon. Muslims are expected to fit into that. At one level they do, and Hizmet is a good example. But another, they retain their fuzziness as we know it from traditional Sufi orders.
Now we have Dr. Serena Hussain. And I'm pleased to see that you are with us. At one point, you were having difficulty getting into the room.
Yes,
It's always a scary moment. But anyway, you're here. And we're thrilled that you're with us.
Yes, thank you. I probably don't have as much to say as the last respondent, but I listened with interest. So I've got to be honest, I have a confession that when Paul asked me to review his book on Hizmet in Europe, I skim-read the email and I literally thought that the book was about the Islamic concept of Hizmet, service, social work. Of course, once I reread the email, I realized that it's on the movement. Nevertheless, I think so. I wanted to say that up front because I think that probably indicates my level of engagement with literature on this movement previously or up to this point. nevertheless, I have worked on social movements who have utilized religion and Islam in particular as a vehicle for political and social mobilization, and particularly within a subcontinent and then diaspora or transnational context. So, and I would say this is mainly sort of around Jammu and Kashmir and northern Pakistan. So I definitely approach this, I would say, wearing my sociologist of religion hat. So I think the comments that follow very much reflect that. So thank you, Paul. It was a very interesting read. It was certainly a thorough account of the development of the movement, the activities, and the reach, particularly, of course, within the European context. But I think for me, one of the questions, certainly within the introductory chapter, or sort of chapter 1 and chapter 2, that kept coming up was why? Why was it that the movement had such reach and was able to generate so much investment? And particularly thinking about it in terms of a transnational or a diaspora movement. Of course, you look at a number of countries with various migrant groups, but also one would imagine a number of similar in terms of some of their activities or some of their aims, Muslim faith-based organizations. So why was it, and I think this was the question that sort of kept coming up for me initially when I first started reading the book, why was it that this movement was able to gain the traction that you described? And I know, again, early on within the introduction, Paul sort of hints at the fact, or talks about the fact, that the movement has been discussed by some authors as a Sufi Jamaat, and also he makes reference to it being discussed by other authors as a new religious movement. And I think for me, locating Hizmet within this kind of theoretical framework up front would have been very useful as a reader who is new to the movement, because I think it would have helped me to explore some of these questions as to why it had the appeal. Of course, some of the characteristics that are common with such movements are charismatic leaders, and I know sort of later on in the book, Paul, you do talk about this, but also I wondered about whether there was a sense of belonging, but progressive belonging. So again, integration seemed to be one of the sort of key aims of some of those initial activities within what were seen as hostile environments. Of course, this was just discussed now in terms of Germany and other locations. So was it that, yes, it's a Muslim faith-based organization, but it's a progressive as well as righteous collective organization to belong to? So I think those are some of the initial questions that were coming up for me. So Paul, as already discussed by Paul and the previous speaker, goes through activities and the historical developments within several of the European countries that the movement was able to sort of really take root in. And I think this is very interesting reading for anybody who explores or is interested in exploring the establishment of Islamic faith or Muslim community organizations in Europe, but also within specific diaspora communities, because it really sort of sets out and plots the progress against a number of different backdrops and within sort of different contexts. So I think there's a real strength in terms of sort of a piece of work on a movement within a European setting or amongst diaspora communities. And of course, these include the Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, Switzerland, the UK, Denmark, France, Germany, which of course has a huge Turkish diaspora, but also, as previously mentioned, places like Spain, which hasn't been associated with Turkish migration. But I think for me, this is also very interesting because it threw up a question about context. Of course, we know that Spain has its own Islamic history and influence, which potentially, and I know other more recent movements have tried to tap on in terms of being a cultural resource almost for sort of placing Islam or new, more recent migrants within a European context. So I think for me, that whole sort of discussion of a movement within various settings provides something very interesting in terms of the extent to which pre-existing local features can have an influence on activity and practice and the different types of activities that a movement would adopt or engage in. But then I also wanted to think a bit more. I know Paul does discuss it, but I think for me, as somebody who is interested in diasporas and transnational movements, I was very curious about whether this movement, as with many others, the extent to which, where they develop within a homeland and then are almost uprooted, or take up root and begin to organize within a different setting, how much they can really open up to non-diaspora communities. And there's a really lovely quote about this in the book, and I'm going to read it out for those of you who haven't read the chapter. But it's one of the people that Paul interviews. And by the way, I also want to say that I think this really adds to the country sort of case studies, because Paul does provide illustrations through conversations and interviews that he's had within those locations. But this particular quote says, "I always said that the Turks were for Hizmet like the oil curse for Saudi Arabia. When Hizmet encounters a Turkish enclave of people in a foreign land, it simply plows into them, serving them. This helps Hizmet to take root among and within the immigrant Turkish community quickly, but it also curses them in a way that, like the Saudi oil, it inhibits them from branching out to other cultures and communities." I'd already had that thought before I came across the quote. I think that's why I wanted to illustrate it, because I sort of discuss the quote a little bit more and the ideas that it raises. So, of course, when we have a movement like this that is now into second, third generation within a diaspora community, inevitably one would assume that its activities, even styles of communication, would reflect the now host environment and therefore take on a less Turkishness, if that's what we can call it. But does that really increase the appeal of an organization or its ability to interact with non-Turkish heritage diasporas in the same way that it does with the Turkish heritage diasporas? And is there more of a universalizing of, say, religious concepts that can be appealing to others? And in a place like the UK, and I'm sure it's the case with places like France that have substantial, significant, in fact, even dominant populations that come from countries other than Turkey. So, of course, in the UK, there's a much larger South Asian Muslim diaspora than there is a Turkish one. And as I read this, I couldn't help but think of other movements that have taken root in the UK within diasporas, such as Tahir al-Qadri's Minhaj al-Quran, which now has a substantive and growing following amongst second, third generation British Pakistanis. And it made me, again, sort of ask this question about whether such transnational faith-based or faith-inspired movements are best suited to their specific diasporas. And if so, is that where their main function inevitably lies. And I say this against the backdrop of this particular movement, because my final question, I think, really was that if this is the case, do diasporas meaningfully engage with movements from the homeland once they have lost favour, or to what extent can they engage once they've lost favour in the homeland? And in this case, in such a catastrophic way. Because if such movements provided a link for migrants missing the home, as described for the first generation, they were also able to provide very valuable, by the sounds of it, sources of cultural, social, and even human capital in terms of the educational facilities supporting students to go on to a higher education. But again, of course, the sort of the integration activity that they had there that helped soften that sort of migrant experience into the host society. So once the value within the homeland is questioned, can they be disassociated somehow? In other words, can they take on, and I know, Paul, you do talk to this within the book, but I think it was really a question mark that came up: to what extent could such a movement take on, for example, an entirely British or German guise that is more than just a guise, but also a new way of establishing itself within a different cultural and political space altogether. In other words, is it possible to isolate the merit, if you like, the merit from the political or reputational difficulties attached with the parent organization by starting a new chapter? And I know you talk about a new chapter, but I just wonder to what extent that's actually possible. But I think the other very, very valuable thing about this study for me was I was reminded of my, unfortunately now late, Professor Roger Ballard, who taught me as an undergraduate at Manchester. And one of the things that I think made me want to go on and study religion and indeed social movements from this sort of perspective was that he would always say that religion is one of the most powerful vehicles for social and political mobilization. But I think, of course, what this reminds us as well is that this still takes on cultural influences. And I think this is the very point for me of the book, actually. And I think it highlights this very well, because there are still various complexities associated with such movements when thinking about them outside of the homeland. They aren't simply a religious movement. There is still, the cultural, if you like, baggage or the cultural elements that can be really difficult to sort of pull apart or even sort of take apart, that mean that they can be translated into different places and different times, but then also lose what they initially brought into those new spaces. So I think those are very much my thoughts on reading the book, and I hope that some of those comments and thoughts were useful.
Back to you, Paul.
So, well, thank you very much, both to Jørgen and to Serena. I'm very grateful you've done, both of you, what I hoped you might do. Serena in bringing very much work in kind of transnational communities to bear. Jørgen with a very majestic kind of historical sweep, which of course his work with European Muslims over the decades, and setting this in a way which I could only tangentially do in a way, because I was trying very much to focus on Hizmet itself, but obviously one has to understand it within a wider setting. And as Jørgen was pointing out, different Muslim organizational developments, political contexts. Serena was pointing out particularly the transnational aspects and dynamics of that. And I think, you know, these two reviews, critiques help to complement and correct and enlarge on what it's possible to do in the book that I've attempted to do. I'm really grateful to Serena for having discovered what it really was about, the invitation, not just to come and talk about Hizmet in general in Europe, but that Hizmet, that you actually decided you would follow through and accept the invitation. So thank you for that. I'll try and, as with the other presentations, reviews of the other book, to give one or two reactions. I won't manage to pick up every point, I think, but I'll try and do that, and then hopefully we can open up into also some wider discussion, which shouldn't just be then questions to me, but there's others here who contribute to these topics. I think this question, Serena, I'll start there, was posing about, I guess, a species of this whole question of the relationship between culture and religion. Fundamentally, of course, in many ways, people acknowledge and understand you can draw some distinction, but when you try to draw the distinction, how you do it, where you draw the lines is extremely problematic. You know, I often remember as a young lecturer in religious studies, teaching or trying to teach very basically about some things about Islam to Muslim background students, and particularly young Muslim women students who in the early 1990s in what was then Derbyshire College of Higher Education. And they were saying, well, you know, we have this form of stuff that comes from our parents, and we don't quite relate to that historical thing about, you know, they never maybe reflected on it in their own cultural background, because until you move transnationally, there's no reason necessarily to ask questions about things that are accepted and are part of the framework. And we used to talk about this image of the onion. You know, if you say, okay, culture and religion, if you peel away the skins of the onion, but if you keep peeling, actually what's left? Nothing. And obviously in one sense, there is no being of a religion of any form unless it is historically, culturally embodied. It doesn't exist, it can't exist without it being, to some extent, embodied. But then the question of the relationship between the dynamic of, you know, are there kind of principles that lie behind and within and between cultural expressions, and how far they can be distinguished is, yeah, and it's not just a Hizmet question, you know, and it's not just a Muslim question, it's not just a migrant question, it's not just a transnational question, it's a question for the majority religious traditions in Europe. What does it mean to be Christian in, for example, in a, is it a post-Christian society? What is it? Is it a pluralistic society? What's the relationship there between cultural inheritance and religious identity and belonging and interpretation? So it's something, in a way, it's a bigger set of questions. I think that's one of the things that both Jørgen and Serena have in different ways highlighted that's very helpful, is that, okay, one can take more of a microscope approach to Hizmet, and in a way I've tried to do that, partly because I wanted to kind of explore the dynamics and also the debate that exists within Hizmet or Hizmets itself about who they are, what their future direction may or may not be. So I wanted to bring that out very much, and that was somewhat at the cost, I guess, of locating also that more broadly, apart from allusions to that. But I do think, I always argue, and particularly in talking with Hizmet people, that, you know, don't over-exceptionalize yourselves. Understand that many of the dynamics that occur in terms of the development of movements, you know, occur in all kinds of religious movements. they have different clothing, they have different emphases because of different backgrounds and trajectories, but there are identifiable things. And I guess that was partly also what Serena was in a way pleading for and saying, why didn't I do it at the beginning of the book, which is to kind of locate Hizmet within certain models. Perhaps particularly Serena as a sociologist wanted me to flag up, particular sociological models and say, as a handle to get into it, where is Hizmet in relation to that? Not necessarily answering the question, but painting these models and then say, I have to say personally, I have something of a slight aversion to doing that, in the same way that when I venture into the fields of Christian theology and the relationship of Christianity with other religions, and people say, well, there's inclusivism, exclusivism, pluralism. I say, no, life is a lot more complicated than that. Theological interpretation, in this sense, to use Jørgen's phrase, religious organizations and movements are a lot more fuzzy, which we picked up this word fuzzy, than to be able to. So I have I guess, an innate resistance slightly in the same way to certain types of theological models, not starting from there. I prefer, when I'm trying to engage with something, to try to engage with it to the best of my ability and understanding in how I think it understands itself, before I bring to bear models that others have developed that might help to some extent or to greater extent to illuminate something about that movement. Because I fear often if one starts with the models and not with the phenomena, if I put it that way around. And I'm not being naive about this because I know I bring my own stuff to it, and one can't do this totally objectively. Though very kind what Jørgen said, that I was trying to write this in that sense as objectively as one can, in the sense of trying to be faithful to what I was hearing, seeing, observing, understanding, as the starting place. So those are a few kind of observations on things particularly brought up by Serena, but coming across to one or two things from Jørgen. I am highly aware that writing books in this territory is difficult, and in honesty, I'm at a stage in my career where, in one sense, I can afford to do this because I'm not beholden to any particular subject group. I'm not beholden even to an institution anymore in the sense of being employed by anyone. I have tried to follow, to the best of my ability, using the critical tools in the study of religion that I've learned from over the years, and try to be, in that sense, also transparent. I know at the beginning of the book, in one sense, you could say, well, I'm trying to head off some of the anticipated criticism. I know that won't do the job because there are very strong positionalities. I have a positionality too, but I hope it's a positionality that's open to engagement, critique, persuasion, argument. Sometimes, particularly in relation to Hizmet and Gülen, my experience has been, and it was an experience before eventually arriving at this very reputable publisher, but I did have an interesting set of journeys through different kind of peer reviewers who, to me, very often didn't seem to be reviewing what I was proposing to do and how, but they were reviewing their own preconceptions about what they thought I should do. So in a sense, the whole experience of doing this project has kind of highlighted those questions for me in a way that kind of inescapable. And yeah, as for lists, one has to take these things seriously. It's not, and the people I interviewed, I really, it was a burden in a way, because people were opening themselves up, opening their experience, talking to me, knowing that things would be said, that lines and connections could be made, friends, relatives, this is a big responsibility. And I don't at all take lightly the responsibility involved in doing these kinds of work. So that kind of just to pick up a bit on what you're starting off with. Now there are many other points to kind of which I haven't briefly addressed, but I do want people to have a chance more generally to discuss, and perhaps some of those we can pick up before we have to conclude. But thank you to both of you, and for those who weren't here in the first bit, these reviews will form part of a special edition of the Journal of Dialogue Studies that will come out in the autumn, and will also contain papers and responses from the next week's series of things on Muslims in dialogue, Christians in dialogue, Jews in dialogue, humanists in dialogue, and will form a special issue. So you'll be able to pick up again, if you missed hearing things, you'll be able to read them in written form come the autumn. Open access journal publication. Thank you.
I should have said that because of the pressures of our dining hall, that we will be finishing about 10-15 minutes earlier than the advertised time. And that's just to ensure that those of you who would like to partake of a meal actually get to the queue first before the undergraduates come and then eat it all up. So, but then with that said, we've still got about 10 minutes or so for questions. So any questions?
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I've been for both sessions and it's been very enlightening. I want to ask something of a leading question. Is the evolution of Hizmet or Hizmets an inevitable or accidental result of Gülen's preaching / teaching?
Yeah, this is what happens when you invite and encourage one of your own doctoral students to come. No.
But it's undergrads as well. My daughters get also in the queue for dinner.
Yeah, is it an inevitable? Well, I don't think it's inevitable, because I don't think anything, human or historical, is inevitable. That's the first thing to say. Is there a strong connection? I think there is, and that's in the way that, if you like, the implicit or actually explicit thesis behind both books, that this interactivity in development between the teaching and then taken forward by the quote that was read, about a group of listeners then becoming etc. But also how that then does play back into, we didn't explore that enough from Martin's question this morning, I think, about how far and in what respects one might say Gülen's approaches to things have been changed by what it is, the questions posed to him, the issues posed to him by people seeking to practice Hizmet. So I think there is a close relationship between, but I don't think there's an inevitability. And there is this, as I keep hammering on, I guess, this word, it's a word that is a small word, but carries a lot with it, the word trauma, that I do think is very real and very profound at multiple levels, organizationally, personally, and Fethullah Gülen himself, so far as I could perceive it and feel it. And I'm talking the words of feeling here because I don't think they're inappropriate to academic endeavor. Indeed, I think in certain contexts, it's very important to operate with that. So when I was able to interview him, I was looking as far as I could for that, as well as for ideas. And because otherwise I don't think I can understand properly. And similarly in listening to individuals, whether asylum seekers, refugees, or people who in Europe, if you like, have grown up in a Hizmet context or whatever, the impact of post-216, again, different and differential in countries, but I mean, you'll read some of the, very, very serious things faced by, for example, in the Netherlands, people whose homes are attacked or bombed and things like this. And this is serious stuff, and it has a traumatic effect. One can't pass over it. So there is no automatic thing, and this trauma thing, and how to deal with that in a way that that seriously takes account of it, that doesn't gloss over it too quickly. I was being interviewed over the coffee break, and I was saying, well, 6 years is not actually a long time. In one sense it is, but in another sense it isn't. We're working through something like that and its implications.
So the experience dimension is quite critical in the shape.
Yeah, I would. Thank you.
Any other questions in the room? Yes.
Why just like, can we compare it with, it is a different comparison, but if we take common law and try to make it civil law, so it would be heavy, right? So you can't necessarily invent a one line of interpretation from centuries old common law treatises, right? So do you see that kind of element in difficulty of understanding history because it has that kind of tradition which comes also from the Ottoman history maybe?
Yeah.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, Anthony. Would you?
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah. It's basically a comparison between common law and civil law, and can you move from one to the other?
Yeah, like the fuzziness of the movement, the difficulty of understanding of it being fluid, not being shaped or understood. So it feels Islamophobia for some, suspicion for others, confusion for the followers of the movement. But when we look at the philosophy of it, it comes from Islam, and Islam is following a kind of more like a common law system rather than civil law. So it doesn't have set written treatises that's easy to follow and put into a shape. So it leaves everyone who studies Hizmet also with a different interpretation, because it doesn't have that kind of philosophy. It is basis.
Okay, so the kind of illustrative comparison is with the contrast between kind of Napoleonic law traditions in most of Europe and common law traditions, and how the former codifies things very structuredly, and the common law tradition is very much more organic, and is the development of Hizmet, and one of the difficulties of understanding it or placing it in relation to other things is that it is, if you like, more of a common law development, and many other Muslim organizations are also like that, part of what Jørgen was bringing out. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something in that, in terms of, it goes back to this fuzzy thing, which I hope isn't a cop-out from analysis, but is actually recognizing that yeah, there are different dynamics and trajectories of work within different religious traditions and movements. They're not all the same. And what Jørgen described as the kind of Northern Protestant version of how to understand religion is only one model. It's a dominant one, socially and politically, in our environment, but it isn't the only one.
Thank you. We have a question remotely from Hakan. So Hakan, please, if you unmute yourself and ask your question.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yes.
All right, well, greetings from across the pond. I'm, hey, Paul, I'm very grateful to see the books have come out finally. So congratulations for that. I just wanted to comment, if I am allowed to do make any comments.
Please.
And, yeah, and the question too. So perhaps I'm the only one attending from the United States, but I was intrigued when I heard the Serena quoting an interviewee saying about Turkishness being a curse. Like the oil was the curse of Saudis. And I understand the sentiment there. However, in many ways, we need to, I think, make some distinctions. When I moved to the States here, like many of my friends in 2015, I came like a bit earlier. I was in a town mixed with Ukrainians who had their own church, Polish people who had their own church, and a very large Jewish community. Well, basically living in their own town, dressed in their own ways. And I they were also very successful partners to the society. And I think for those people coming to a new place and seeking their home compatriots, own compatriots, I think that's a very natural thing to do. As many of you British people would know, Fethullah is a town filled with the British people. You know, Fethullah is a beautiful place. Germans prefer Alanya, I guess, or Antalya. Russians go to Alanya. So it's a natural magnetism is there, which I think we need to understand. But also, I think the Hizmet community, perhaps things are different in Europe, and I understand the boundaries of this book, this research being made for Europe only. I think the Hizmet people, whether they're in the States or in Europe, we have much less Turkish population in the States, obviously, but the Turkish community who came recently to Europe, they're as much foreign to the Turks that came before as they are to the local nationalities. They're not a part of the Diyanet community. The Turks, who, especially in Germany, I think that is the case, they're much in line with the current regime in Turkey than they are to the Hizmet Turkish people. So what I see, I'm sure Paul may comment on this much better than me, but wherever they go, Hizmet people are much in touch with the locals than they are with the Turkish community there. This is more so in the States. I just can confess we had more iftar dinners in temples and churches than we had in mosques this past Ramadan. I'm friends with, I had friends, neighbors coming over for iftar, and none of them were Muslims. So if there is a community that will engage with the locals in a more positive engagement, I think that's the Hizmet community. Maybe also I want to hear from Paul, that's not again a part of the book, but how the demographics of the Turks that came to the US are different than the ones that moved to UK and Europe from past generations. So the level of engagement of the Hizmet especially and other Turkish populations that move to the States, be they are in different professional works or in academia, I think there's a huge difference than the ones in Europe. So I would be happy to hear from Paul if these comments make any sense.
To you, Paul.
Thank you. Nice to see you. I'll only speak very briefly to that. I don't actually have very deep knowledge, and I haven't particularly looked into, in that sense, the demographic profile of Turks or Hizmet in the US. But what I do know is, yes, coming to the broader kind of Muslim profile in the States, it is and has been, I think, quite distinct as compared with European countries. The socio economic groupings and levels have been quite different, I think, compared to certainly to the early European migrations, and much more professional, as you're pointing out. Also perhaps in more recent times, but you can tell me about that, the extent to which, as Jørgen was pointing out, the extent to which refugee or asylum seeker arrivals, not only in Hizmet, but also in the wider Muslim scene, have kind of, if you like, disrupted what was already there, or not. Disrupted, using that word in a neutral sense, it might actually be bringing good impetuses, or it might be bringing difficult ones. So I think there are distinct things, and as we were saying earlier, perhaps there's another research project and another book on Hizmet in Eastern Central Europe and the Balkans, and maybe somebody would like to take up, a similar challenge in relation to the USA or North America, if you want to extend to Canada as well. But thanks for bringing that transatlantic perspective.
Thank you. I think we need to close then. It's gone 6 o'clock. So first, let me say a fantastic congratulations to Professor Paul Weller on what is an amazing achievement of writing 2 books at once. A subject that clearly comes with an emotional and psychological cost. So first, let's show appreciation to Professor Paul. And also thanks to all those who contributed to this very rich conversation, to Professor Paul Weller, to Dr. Martin Whittingham, to Dr. Serena Hussain, and Professor Jørgen Nielsen. And oh, good morning.
You said Paul Weller, you get mixing the 2 Pauls.
Professor Paul Pinnett is what I meant to say, like all these surveys. And thank you to all of you who come to make such a fantastic day. It's been a long time in the planning, and you never quite know who's going to turn up, and you never quite know how it's going to go. But it has, well, certainly exceeded my expectation. It's just a shame that the books were not here, but that's not our fault. That's not our fault.
But please, a reminder, and if
Yes.
you missed that earlier,
Yeah.
the leaflets that are on the back allow you to purchase at a discounted price for 1 month.
1 month.
If anybody is listening in and hasn't had such a leaflet, because they were circulated in various media, but if you contact us at the college here, we can give you a copy of that code, which you can enter. If you want to buy a book, you can enter it into the Springdale Palgrave website.
I think soft copies are available as well.
Yeah, and there will be, yes.
Okay, well, so thank you very much.
Next week.
Yeah, and next week our speaker is Dr. Serena.
Cheravali Contractor.
Yep, yeah, Dr. Cheravali Contractor, and she's Associate Professor of the Research Institute of Peace, Security and Social Justice at Coventry University, and the theme is Muslims and Dialogue. And we meet at 5 o'clock here, and we go through to 6:15. And if you want to stay for a meal, then please let me know, and then we can sign you in. I have asked those of you who are not on our mailing list, please, if you give me your email address. So,
I have a question.
Yeah, go on.
Will the next events be available to be joined through Zoom as well?
Yes, well, all our events are hybrid. So all our events are hybrid, but it's a different link. It's a different link next week. So the next 4 sessions are different links. And then our final is another sort of seminar with a different link again.
Okay.
But actually, that's all detailed in the flyer. So I'll send you a flyer if you want the mailing list.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us online. We hope to see you again soon.
Anthony, took a couple of photos. Would you like to get a photo with you and Paul?
Anthony, shall we take one?
Yes, we can.